Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This story takes place just a couple of years ago in a small industrial town nestled on the outskirts of a larger city. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slower, predictable pace. The winters were cold and biting, with frost settling in thick layers on the factory rooftops, while the summers were muggy and restless. It's the kind of place where late-night shifts were lonely, but often uneventful, just how I like them. I've worked as a security guard for years, mostly in office buildings and warehouses. The night shifts were ideal. I liked the quiet, the routine, and the way I could keep to myself. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and honestly, it suited me just fine. My current post was a sprawling office complex. By day, it bustled with workers typing away in cubicles and making endless phone calls. But by night, the building became my domain, a silent maze of fluorescent lights and endless corridors. The company had invested heavily in technology, so most of my job revolved around monitoring a network of security cameras. There were over 50 of them, spanning every corner of the building, from the dimly lit parking lot to the storage rooms in the basement. My little control room sat tucked away on the first floor. It had a large desk cluttered with monitors, a cheap coffee machine that I relied on far too often, and a small window that overlooked the empty lot outside. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I preferred it. After all, who would want to spend their nights in a deserted office building, except for someone who found peace in the quiet? But on some nights, the quiet could feel oppressive, like it was pressing down on me, making every little sound like the creak of a chair or the hum of the air conditioning seem magnified. For the most part, my nights followed the same routine. I'd clock in just before midnight, grab a cup of stale coffee, and settle into my chair. Then, I'd cycle through the camera feeds, checking for anything unusual. Most of the time, the building was still. Occasionally, I'd spot a stray animal wandering into the parking lot or catch the janitor finishing up his late-night cleaning. The janitor, Mr. Fletcher, was one of the few people I interacted with on my shift. He was in his late 60s, a wiry man with a limp and a quiet demeanor. We'd exchange a few words during his break, and he'd always leave with a slight nod before disappearing down the hallway with his cart. He didn't talk much, but I didn't mind. I wasn't there to make friends. But as mundane as the job was, it came with its own peculiar rhythm. The building had an eerie way of settling into itself after everyone left, with faint creaks and groans echoing through the empty halls. At first, I chalked it up to the natural sounds of an old structure. But there was something about this place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every now and then. The quiet wasn't always comforting. There were nights when it felt like the cameras were watching me instead of the other way around. I'd glance over my shoulder, feeling a prickling sensation, only to find nothing there. But I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, spending hours alone in an empty building could make anyone's imagination run wild. One thing that struck me early on was how the cameras seemed to catch things that didn't always make sense. For example, the motion sensors would sometimes trigger in areas that should have been completely empty. I'd check the feed, only to find the corridor or office completely still. It wasn't enough to alarm me. It was probably just a technical glitch, I thought. But over time, these small anomalies began to add up. I kept most of these observations to myself. After all, who would believe me? A night guard claiming the cameras were acting up. People would just laugh it off, saying I'd been alone too long or needed more sleep. Still, there were nights when I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. And while I tried to rationalize it, part of me felt like the building was trying to tell me something, like it held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. But it wasn't until a few weeks into my post that things began to change. What started as a routine job slowly became something else, something that still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. It began on a Wednesday night. I remember it clearly because it was the kind of uneventful evening I'd come to expect from this job. The sky was overcast, the lot outside was empty, and the only sound in my little control room was the faint buzz of the monitors. I had just finished my second cup of coffee and was settling into the long stretch of hours before sunrise. Around 2 o'clock, the motion sensor alarm for camera 14 went off. It was one of the cameras positioned in the west wing of the third floor, an area used mostly for storage and rarely accessed, especially at night. I glanced at the monitor, expecting to see nothing but an empty hallway bathed in the pale glow of fluorescent lights. Instead, I noticed something peculiar, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow moving at the far end of the corridor. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, maybe a moth fluttering too close to the lens or the camera adjusting its focus. But as I leaned in closer, I saw it again. The shadow was elongated, almost humanoid in shape, but it didn't move like a person. It drifted as though it were floating just above the ground. There were no defined features, just a dark, amorphous form that lingered at the edge of the frame. I toggled between the nearby cameras, trying to get a better view. Camera 15, which covered the next section of the hallway, showed nothing. The corridor was completely still, just as it should have been. When I returned to camera 14, the shadow was gone. I sat back in my chair, my heart beating a little faster than I'd have liked to admit. "It's just the system acting up," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. These cameras were old, prone to glitches, and I'd seen my fair share of technical hiccups over the years. Still, I couldn't quite ignore the way the shadow had moved, so fluid and deliberate. For the rest of the night, I found myself glancing at the monitors more often than usual. My routine checks became more frequent, my gaze lingering on camera 14 every time I cycled through the feeds. But nothing else happened. The shadow didn't return, and by the time my shift ended, I had almost convinced myself it was nothing worth worrying about. The next night, I came in feeling more like myself. Whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen was a one-off event, I told myself. I clocked in, poured my coffee, and settled into my chair. For the first few hours, everything was quiet, just the way I liked it. But then, around the same time as the night before, the motion sensor for camera 14 triggered again. This time, I was ready. I turned my full attention to the monitor, watching as the camera feed flickered slightly before stabilizing. The hallway was empty, at least at first glance. I squinted at the screen, my eyes scanning every inch of the frame. And then, there it was, the shadow. It appeared in the exact same spot as the previous night, lingering at the far end of the corridor. But this time, it moved closer, slowly and deliberately, as though it were aware of the camera's presence. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I watched. There was something deeply unsettling about the way it moved, almost as if it were studying its surroundings. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a shadow, it was something watching. I toggled to camera 15 again, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was moving down the hallway. But just like the night before, there was nothing. When I switched back to camera 14, the shadow was gone. My hand hovered over the radio, debating whether to call Mr. Fletcher, who was somewhere in the building, finishing up his rounds. But what would I even say? That I'd seen a shadow on the cameras? That I thought the building might be haunted? Instead, I decided to investigate on my own. Grabbing my flashlight, I left the control room and made my way to the west wing. The hallway looked exactly as it had on the monitor's sterile, silent, and utterly devoid of life. I shone my flashlight down the corridor, illuminating the walls and the floor in front of me. There was nothing there, no sign of movement, no explanation for what I'd seen. I checked every storage room, opening each door and stepping inside to make sure I wasn't missing anything. The rooms were filled with filing cabinets, old office supplies, and forgotten equipment, all coated in a fine layer of dust. There was no one there, No reason for the motion sensor to have been triggered. I returned to the control room feeling more unnerved than ever. It wasn't just the shadow itself that unsettled me, it was the fact that it seemed to follow a pattern. Same time, same place, 2 nights in a row. Over the next few nights, I found myself growing increasingly anxious as 2 o'clock approached. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every flicker of the monitors, my body tense with anticipation. And like clockwork, the motion sensor for camera 14 triggered each night at the same time. The shadow's behavior, however, began to change. It lingered longer, moved more deliberately, and at times seemed to grow darker and more defined. One night, it moved so close to the camera that the screen was filled with nothing but blackness for several seconds before the feed returned to normal. Each time, I ventured out to investigate, and each time, I found nothing. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a problem with the camera lens, or even some kind of prank. But deep down, I knew there was something else at play, something I couldn't explain. By the end of the week, I was barely sleeping during the day. My mind kept replaying the shadow's movements, the way it seemed to watch, to linger. It wasn't just an anomaly on the camera. It felt like a presence, something that didn't belong. It wasn't long before the incidents began to escalate, pulling me deeper into a mystery I wasn't prepared to face. The unease I had felt during the first few nights was nothing compared to what followed. Whatever was happening in that building seemed to be growing stronger, more deliberate. It wasn't just confined to the West Wing anymore. The incidents started spreading, as if whatever was causing them was becoming emboldened, or worse, aware of me. It began innocently enough, if you could call it that. Lights would flicker in areas where no one had been. The motion sensors for other cameras, ones that had never been triggered in the months I had worked there, started going off. But every time I checked the monitors, the hallways were empty. One night, I was doing my usual rounds in the lobby when I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the upper floors. The sound was distinct, deliberate, and far too heavy to be an animal or the building settling. I froze, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly as I pointed it toward the staircase. "Mr. Fletcher?" I called out, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. There was no answer. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had started. The air around me felt heavier somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I forced myself to move, climbing the stairs slowly, the soles of my boots scuffing against the concrete steps. The second floor was eerily quiet. Each step I took echoed down the long corridor, the sound amplifying the emptiness around me. I made my way to the West Wing, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door to the storage area was slightly ajar, a detail that sent a chill racing down my spine. I distinctly remembered locking it earlier in the night. Pushing the door open, I shone my light inside. The room was as I had left it. Rows of filing cabinets, old desks, and forgotten office supplies. But then I noticed something new. At the far end of the room, a single chair had been pulled out from one of the desks, positioned as though someone had been sitting there recently. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. The air in the room felt colder, and I swear I could hear the faintest sound like a whisper, just on the edge of my perception. It wasn't words exactly, but it was enough to send me bolting back to the control room. By the time I got back, my hands were shaking so badly that I almost spilled my coffee. I stared at the monitors, half expecting the shadow to reappear, but the screens were eerily still. For the first time, I considered quitting. Whatever was happening in that building, I wasn't sure I wanted to be a part of it anymore. But curiosity and maybe stubbornness kept me coming back. I needed answers. The next night, I decided to set up a sort of experiment. I placed a few objects in the West Wing corridor, an old chair, a cardboard box, and a broom I found in the janitor's closet. I wanted to see if anything moved, to confirm whether I was dealing with something tangible or if my mind was playing tricks on me. For most of the night, nothing happened. The hours dragged by in a haze of caffeine and exhaustion, and I started to think my little experiment would be a bust. But then, just after 2 o'clock, The motion sensor for camera 14 lit up again. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the screen. The shadow was back, darker and more defined than ever. But this time, it didn't just linger at the far end of the hallway. It moved directly toward the objects I had placed, its amorphous form swallowing the light as it passed beneath the fluorescent fixtures. The chair tipped over first, as though someone had kicked it. Then the box slid across the floor, its edges scraping against the tiles in a way that made my skin crawl. The broom, however, was the worst. It didn't just fall, it lifted into the air, hovering for a few seconds before dropping with a loud clatter. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a malfunctioning camera or a trick of the light. Something was in that building, and it was interacting with the physical world. Summoning what little courage I had left, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to the west wing. The hallway was silent, the objects exactly where I had seen them on the monitor. The chair was on its side, the box wedged against the wall, and the broom lying at an awkward angle in the middle of the floor. I crouched down to examine the broom, my fingers brushing against the handle. It was ice cold, as though it had been left outside on a winter's night. I straightened up quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. Things only got worse from there. Over the next week, the activity became almost constant. Doors that had been locked would be found wide open. The elevator, which required a keycard to operate after hours, would move between floors on its own, the ding of its arrival echoing through the empty halls. And then there were the voices. They started as faint murmurs, indistinct and barely audible. I would hear them in the control room, coming through the intercom system or echoing faintly through the building's corridors. Sometimes they sounded like whispers, other times like distant laughter. One night, while reviewing the security footage from the previous shift, I caught something that made my blood run cold. In one of the recordings, the shadow was visible not on camera 14, but on camera 3, which covered the main lobby. It was there for only a moment, just long enough to cross the frame before disappearing into the wall. I rewound the footage, watching the shadow's movement over and over again. It wasn't just floating anymore, it was walking, its shape more defined, almost human. I decided to call Mr. Fletcher. If anyone could give me answers, it was him. He had been working here for years and had probably seen things I couldn't even imagine. When he answered, his voice was calm, almost indifferent, as though he had been expecting my call. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked. The question sent a jolt of fear through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was a long pause before he replied. "I've seen it too. We all have, at one point or another. But it's never been this active before." "What is it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it is, it's tied to this building. And it's not going anywhere." His words offered no comfort, only confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect. I started researching the building's history, digging through old records and archives in search of anything that might explain what was happening. What I found only deepened the mystery. The building had been constructed in the 1970s, originally serving as the headquarters for a now-defunct manufacturing company. There were rumors of workplace accidents, even a fire that had claimed the lives of several employees. But the records were incomplete, the details vague. I also learned that the West Wing, where most of the activities seemed to be concentrated, had been added later, in the mid-1980s. There were whispers of strange occurrences, even then tools going missing, workers hearing voices in empty rooms. The more I uncovered, the more questions I had. Was the shadow connected to these events? Or was it something older, something tied to the land itself? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear. The incidents weren't going to stop. The tension in the building had become almost unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, set my nerves on edge. I began to dread my shifts, counting down the hours until sunrise when I could leave and feel the warmth of daylight on my skin. But even then, I knew I couldn't avoid what was coming. The shadow wasn't just a passive observer anymore. It was moving closer, growing stronger. And deep down, I had the sinking feeling that it was coming for me. The night the shadow finally revealed itself in full, the entire building seemed to hold its breath. The usual flickers of light and distant noises had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me like a weight. The air felt thicker, and every step I took seemed to echo far louder than it should have. Something was different. I had been on edge the entire evening, pacing the control room and sipping lukewarm coffee just to stay alert. By now, I had grown used to the eerie occurrences, but that night felt charged with a new kind of energy, a volatile one. As I stared at the monitors, I noticed something strange. All the cameras were functioning, but the feeds from the West Wing were darker than usual, as if a shadow had crept over the entire area. At exactly 2:33 a.m., the motion detector for camera 14 lit up, followed by camera 15, and then camera 16. The sequence of lights suggested movement, deliberate, purposeful, and coming toward the center of the building. My heart pounded in my chest as I switched between the feeds, but the screens only showed empty hallways. Then I heard it. A low, resonant sound, like a distant hum, reverberated through the building. It wasn't mechanical, nor did it resemble any sound I had ever heard before. It was almost alive. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, knowing that staying in the control room would do me no good. If this thing was making its way to me, I needed to meet it on my terms. I started toward the West Wing, my footsteps hesitant and my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The hum grew louder with every step, vibrating through the walls and floor. When I reached the corridor, the air was so cold that my breath misted in front of me, the flashlight beam catching each exhale like smoke. The objects I had left there, the chair, the box, and the broom were gone. The hallway was completely empty, the tiles gleaming under the flickering lights. And then, at the far end of the corridor, it appeared. The shadow wasn't amorphous anymore. It had taken a shape, humanoid, but wrong in ways I couldn't fully describe. Its form shifted and pulsed, as though it were made of liquid darkness. It had no discernible face, but I felt its gaze on me heavy, probing, and suffocating. My legs locked, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Fear coursed through me, freezing every muscle as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Then, the shadow began to move. It didn't walk so much as glide, its form rippling with every motion. The hum grew deafening, a sound that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my skull. I stumbled backward, my flashlight trembling in my hand as the beam wavered across the walls. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my terror. "What do you want?" The shadow stopped, tilting its head, or what I assumed was its head, ever so slightly. For a brief moment, the hum shifted, almost resembling words. They were garbled, distorted, and impossible to understand, but there was a cadence to them, a rhythm that suggested communication. "Leave." The words seemed to form out of the noise, clear and sharp in my mind. I staggered back, the command slamming into me like a physical force. My instincts screamed at me to run, but some stubborn part of me needed answers. "Why?" I shouted, my voice raw. "What are you? Why are you here?" The shadow didn't respond with words this time. Instead, the hum surged, and the air around me grew heavier. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the sound overwhelmed me. Images flashed in my mind, fragmented and nonsensical. A fire, a figure trapped behind glass, hands clawing at the walls. Pain, loss, anger. It was then that I understood. The shadow wasn't just a malevolent force, it was something more complex, a fragment of something that had once been human. The emotions it conveyed were raw and primal, but they carried an undeniable sense of purpose. It wasn't just haunting the building, it was bound to it, trapped in a cycle of rage and sorrow that it couldn't escape. The revelation didn't bring comfort, only a deeper sense of dread. If this thing was the remnant of a person, what had happened to them? And why was their suffering so intense that it could manifest in this way? Before I could process these thoughts, the shadow surged forward, closing the distance between us in an instant. I scrambled backward, my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to fail. The darkness around me seemed alive, pressing in from all sides as the shadow loomed over me. Just when I thought it would consume me, the humming stopped. The silence was abrupt, almost deafening in its absence. The shadow recoiled slightly, as though it were struggling against something unseen. That's when I saw it, a faint glow emanating from the end of the corridor. The light was soft, golden, and warm, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness that surrounded me. It grew brighter, pushing back the shadows and filling the hallway with a soothing radiance. The shadow writhed, its form distorting as the light enveloped it. For the first time, I heard a sound from it that wasn't a hum, a low, mournful wail that echoed with despair. The light intensified, and the shadow began to dissolve, its edges fraying like smoke caught in a breeze. And then it was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, my body trembling and my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The warmth of the light lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had preceded it. When I finally mustered the strength to stand, I realized that the building was completely silent. The oppressive energy I had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. The hallway was empty, the objects I had placed there nowhere to be seen. I made my way back to the control room, my steps slow and unsteady. The monitors showed nothing unusual, just empty hallways and vacant rooms. It was as if the shadow had never been there at all. But I knew better. The events of that night stayed with me long after I left the building. I didn't quit, not right away at least. I felt a strange sense of responsibility, as though I owed it to whatever had happened there to see things through. Over time, the strange occurrences stopped. The lights stopped flickering, the motion sensors stopped triggering without cause, and the voices faded into memory. It was as if the shadow's presence had been the source of it all, and with its departure, the building could finally rest. But every now and then, when I walked the halls late at night, I thought I could feel something, just a faint echo of the shadow's energy, lingering in the corners of the building. It wasn't malevolent anymore, though. If anything, it felt peaceful. Perhaps the light had done more than banish the shadow. Perhaps it had freed it. When the morning sun finally broke through the horizon, its golden rays streaming through the dusty windows of the building, it brought with it a strange and profound stillness. The events of the night before hung heavy in my mind, but the oppressive feeling of dread that had plagued the building for months had lifted. I sat alone in the control room, the monitors glowing faintly in the dim light. My hands still trembled as I gripped the edge of the desk, trying to ground myself. The shadow was gone, of that I was certain, but what it had left behind was something I couldn't fully articulate. Relief? Closure? Maybe both, or perhaps neither. As the first rays of light poured into the west wing, I forced myself to retrace the steps of the previous night. I needed to confirm that what I had experienced wasn't some kind of fever dream. Every inch of the hallway looked as it always had, sterile, quiet, and devoid of life. There was no sign of the shadow or the faint golden glow that had saved me. The janitor, Carlos, arrived early, as he always did. He greeted me with his usual cheerful demeanor, though his expression turned serious when he saw my face. "Long night, huh?" he asked, setting down his mop. "You have no idea," I muttered, my voice hoarse. I debated telling him about the shadow, the light, and the entire ordeal. But as I watched him move through the space, completely unfazed, I realized that no one else could understand what had happened. Over the next few days, the building settled into an uncharacteristic calm. The flickering lights, the faint whispers, and the unexplainable movements stopped entirely. It was as though the shadow had taken every ounce of lingering energy with it when it vanished. But even as the disturbances ceased, I couldn't shake the lingering questions. What had the shadow been? A person trapped between worlds? A manifestation of unresolved pain? The fragmented images I had seen in my mind suggested a tragedy, but I had no way of piecing together the full story. I pored over the building's records, searching for anything that might give me a clue. Old blueprints, employee files, and even news articles yielded little information. The building's history was mundane, a corporate office in its prime, later abandoned due to budget cuts. Then, Tucked away in a dusty filing cabinet, I found it, a faded newspaper clipping dated 10 years earlier. The headline read, "Fire claims 3 lives in downtown office building." The article described a blaze that had erupted late at night, likely caused by faulty wiring. The victims were 2 employees working overtime and a security guard who had tried to save them. The building had been gutted by the fire, but its structure had been deemed salvageable and eventually renovated. My stomach turned as I read the names of the deceased. One of them, Daniel Vega, was the security guard. He had been stationed in the West Wing. Armed with this information, I felt a growing sense of obligation to acknowledge what had happened. If the shadow was Daniel or some remnant of him, then his restless presence made a terrible kind of sense. His actions that night had been heroic, but his life had ended in pain and fire. I reached out to a local medium, a woman named Alina, who had a reputation for helping people connect with lingering spirits. I wasn't sure if I believed in such things, but after everything I had experienced, I was willing to try anything to bring peace to the building. Alina arrived a few nights later, carrying a small satchel of candles, incense, and other tools I didn't recognize. She moved through the West Wing with a quiet determination, stopping occasionally to light a candle or murmur a prayer. "This place holds pain," she said softly, her eyes scanning the empty hallway. "But it's not malevolent. It's lost." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Alina performed a simple ritual, lighting candles in each corner of the wing and burning sage to cleanse the space. As she worked, I felt the air shift lighter, warmer, and less oppressive. When she finished, she turned to me with a faint smile. "He's gone now," she said. "Or rather, he's free." The changes were immediate. The building felt brighter, less foreboding. Even my coworkers, who had previously joked about the creepy vibes, commented on how much more welcoming the space felt. For me, though, the experience left a lasting mark. I stayed on the job for a few more months, but every night I patrolled the West Wing, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadow again. When I finally decided to leave the job, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of gratitude. The building had given me a story I would carry with me for the rest of my life, a story of courage, tragedy, and ultimately, peace. Even now, I think about that shadow and the golden light that dispelled it. Was it truly Daniel Vega, seeking release from the torment of his untimely death? Or was it something else entirely, something beyond human understanding? I'll never know for sure. But what I do know is that the experience taught me to respect the unseen forces in the world, the echoes of lives that have left their mark in ways we can't always explain. The building still stands, no longer haunted, but imbued with a quiet reverence for the events that unfolded there. And though I've moved on to a new chapter in my life, a part of me remains connected to that place, where the shadow met the light and a restless spirit found peace. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest edges of memory, but there are some experiences that remain vivid no matter how many years pass. What happened in that building, the shadow, the light, and the overwhelming sense of presence is one of those memories for me. I've since moved on from security work. These days, I manage a quiet desk job that feels like the polar opposite of my old life. No dark hallways, no late night patrols, and certainly no flickering monitors that show more than they should. On the surface, it's a mundane existence, but every now and then, I find myself thinking back to that time and feeling grateful for the calmness I now enjoy. The shadow's presence wasn't something I could easily explain to anyone, not even myself. Was it truly the spirit of Daniel Vega? Was it an imprint of trauma left behind in a place where lives ended too soon? Or was it something even stranger, an entity that defied any human understanding? These questions have no clear answers, and I've come to accept that they likely never will. And yet, that doesn't bother me as much as it once did. Not everything in life needs to be fully understood. Some mysteries are meant to remain just that, mysteries. But one thing I do know is this: the light that appeared in my darkest moment was as real as the shadow itself. Whether it was a manifestation of Daniel's redemption, a force of good intervening at the last possible moment, or simply my mind's desperate response to fear, it saved me. The experience left me with more than just memories. It changed how I view the world and my place in it. I used to think of myself as a rational, grounded person who didn't give much thought to the supernatural or the spiritual. I believed in what I could see, hear, and touch, nothing more, nothing less. But now, I'm not so quick to dismiss what can't be explained. Whether it's a shadow moving in the corner of your vision, a sudden chill in the air, or a sense that you're not alone, I've learned to pay attention to those moments. They may not always have a tangible explanation, but they carry weight all the same. I've also learned the importance of acknowledging the stories that places hold. Buildings, objects, and even people carry echoes of the past. When those echoes grow loud enough to be heard, ignoring them isn't an option. Sometimes the only way forward is to confront them, no matter how frightening or uncomfortable that may be. I haven't returned to the building since I left the job. Occasionally, I'll hear about it in passing a new company renting the space, minor renovations being done to the west wing, but I've never felt the urge to go back. From what I've heard, there haven't been any further reports of strange activity. The flickering lights have stopped, the unsettling whispers are gone, and the eerie sense of being watched has faded. It's as if the building itself has found peace, just as I have. A part of me wonders if Daniel Vega, or whatever force had been haunting the building, finally found what he was looking for. Perhaps the light wasn't just for me, perhaps it was for him as well. It was the middle of summer when I decided to go camping. A perfect time, really, to escape the noise of the city and recharge in nature. I had always been drawn to the outdoors, finding solace in the quiet of the woods. No phones, no distractions, just me and the vast expanse of nature. I had done it many times before, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the solitude, or perhaps the fact that I was going solo for the first time in years. But whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. The trip started off like any other camping experience. I packed my gear tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, and the usual assortment of necessities. The drive out to the campsite was uneventful. Rolling hills, dense forests, and winding roads. I was heading to a more secluded spot this time, a little-known site deep in the woods. The kind of place where people rarely venture. It was known for its breathtaking views and lack of nearby neighbors. Perfect for someone like me, who enjoyed a bit of peace and quiet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I set up camp. The air was crisp, a refreshing break from the humidity of the city. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and the stars slowly began to twinkle above me. It was serene, and for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. I wasn't alone, of course. I shared the campsite with the sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. But I enjoyed it. There was something soothing about being enveloped by nature, almost as though the forest itself was wrapping me in its arms. I built a small fire, and as the flames flickered, I sat back in my camping chair and savored the warmth. The crackling of the fire was the only thing that seemed to break the silence. The evening went by without incident. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, read a bit of a book, and then crawled into my tent. The sound of the fire was fading as I drifted off to sleep, the forest quieting down around me. It was peaceful, safe, even. Little did I know that, just beyond the soft glow of my campfire, something was starting to stir. It started as a subtle feeling, a nagging sensation at the back of my mind, like I was being watched. But I pushed it aside. After all, I was just being paranoid. There was nothing to be afraid of in the woods. I had camped in more remote places before, and nothing had ever happened. This was just my mind playing tricks on me. The wind rustling the trees, the branches creaking as they swayed, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I told myself to relax and just enjoy the night. There was no reason to worry. The forest was just doing its thing. It was late, and I was alone in the woods. Of course, I was going to feel a little uneasy. Everyone does when they're in a secluded place at night. I settled back in my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come easily. But even as I drifted off, the feeling of being watched lingered. It was like an invisible presence hovering just out of sight, one that I couldn't explain. And then, just as I began to slip into a more peaceful state, I heard a faint sound, like footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps in the dirt. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe, or even another camper who had lost their way. But the sound came again, louder this time. Step, pause, step, pause. My breath hitched, and I held my own as I listened more intently. The footsteps weren't coming from the direction of the trail or the campgrounds. They were coming from somewhere near my tent. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that it was just the wind or some other natural occurrence. But there was something about it, something unnerving. The steps weren't random. They were purposeful, measured, as if someone was walking in a slow, deliberate manner, making sure their footsteps could be heard. I lay still, straining to hear. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat form at the back of my neck. The footsteps grew closer, inching closer to the tent. They stopped right outside, just out of sight, as if whoever or whatever was there was waiting for something. I held my breath, not daring to move. The minutes stretched on, the footsteps remaining just outside my tent, as if whatever it was had no intention of leaving. My mind raced. Was it another camper? No one else was supposed to be around here. Was it an animal? Maybe, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew. My hands were clammy as I reached for the flashlight at my side. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart hammering in my chest. But when I peered outside, I saw nothing. No one. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of life. Just the empty forest, stretching out into the darkness. My mind screamed at me to run, to pack up and leave immediately, but I couldn't move. I stayed frozen, staring into the night, waiting for something, anything to give me a sign that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing, not even a sound. I quickly zipped the tent back up and lay there in the silence, staring into the dark, trying to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew something had been out there. Something had been watching me, and I didn't know if it had left, or if it was still there, just waiting for the right moment to make itself known. As I lay there, struggling to calm my racing heart, the forest around me grew eerily quiet. Not even the usual night sounds of rustling leaves or animal calls. Just silence. I lay there in the dark, heart still pounding, listening to the eerie silence that had settled over the campsite. There were no crickets, no owls, not even the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Just the unsettling stillness of the woods pressing in around me. The footsteps had stopped, but that nagging feeling like I wasn't alone refused to let go. I tried to shake it off, but every creak of the tent or crack of a twig outside seemed to set my nerves on edge. I couldn't explain it. Something didn't feel right. Not anymore. I lay there for what seemed like hours, my mind racing, turning over the events of the evening. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. Maybe it had been the wind or some animal I couldn't identify. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The steps had been too deliberate, too purposeful. And whatever or whoever had been outside my tent had been close. Too close. Eventually, the silence outside my tent became unbearable. I forced myself to sit up, gripping the flashlight tightly in my hands. My pulse still raced, and I could feel the sweat trickling down the back of my neck. I had to know. I had to see if there was anything out there. I unzipped the tent again, just enough to stick my head out, keeping my flashlight at the ready. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the rocks, the scattered brush around me. But there was nothing. No sign of movement. No footprints in the dirt. The campfire had long since died down, leaving only the faintest glow in the distance. The night seemed completely still. I sighed, trying to push the tension from my body. It had to be nothing. just my imagination getting the best of me. After all, I had camped in the wilderness before, and this was no different. Or was it? The woods around me felt wrong somehow. It wasn't the usual quiet I was used to. It was too still, too empty. I couldn't hear any distant calls from animals or the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. Just silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural. I spent the next few minutes scanning the area with the flashlight, half expecting something to jump out at me. But there was nothing. No movement, no shapes in the dark. Nothing to explain the footsteps I had heard earlier. The fear that had gripped me earlier began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I was out in the woods, alone for the first time in a while. It could all be in my head. Reluctantly, I crawled back into the safety of my tent and zipped it up tight. I tried to ignore the creeping sense that something was just outside, watching. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind to settle. I could hear the soft rustle of fabric as I shifted in my sleeping bag, and the quiet hiss of the wind as it passed through the trees. The world outside seemed unchanged, but inside me, something had shifted. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every noise outside, the whisper of a branch brushing against the tent, the crackling of leaves beneath something heavy, sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever had been outside my tent earlier was still there, lurking in the shadows. But eventually, exhaustion took over. I drifted off to a restless sleep. The image of the empty woods outside my tent still burned into my mind. The next morning, I woke up to the soft light of dawn filtering through the tent. The air was cool, and the usual morning sounds of the forest had returned. Birds chirped in the trees, and the wind rustled the leaves in a calming, familiar rhythm. I tried to shake off the events of the night before, but the unease still lingered. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about that silence the night before didn't sit right with me. I got out of my tent, stretched, and tried to get back into the rhythm of the day. The forest was beautiful in the early morning light, the sunlight filtering through the trees and casting long shadows on the ground. I started gathering my things, making coffee over the fire, and preparing for a day of hiking. The usual routine, but the sense that something was off was still there. In the back of my mind, I kept thinking about the footsteps. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head, to distract myself from the nagging feeling. The trail near the campsite was easy enough to follow, wide, well-worn, and marked with occasional signs for hikers. As I walked, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. It was just a quiet night in the woods, a little too quiet maybe, but nothing to be afraid of. I could hear the rustle of the leaves, the distant chirp of a bird, and the occasional scurrying of small animals in the underbrush. But then, something caught my eye. It was faint at first, just a glimmer of something off the path. A flash of movement, quick and fleeting, just out of the corner of my vision. My pulse spiked again as I turned my head to look. There was nothing there, just the trees. I frowned, shaking my head. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something that didn't belong. I continued down the path, trying to ignore the unease that was building in my chest. The further I went, the more I noticed things that didn't sit right. The ground seemed too soft, like someone or something had recently walked through the area, but there were no clear footprints. No sign of any disturbance. Just a strange, unsettling sense that I wasn't alone. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the campsite. The walk hadn't been as soothing as I'd hoped, and I just wanted to return to familiar ground. As I neared the campsite, the feeling intensified. I could sense something nearby, just beyond the trees, watching. It was a sensation that settled in my stomach, heavy and cold. When I reached my camp, I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the tension. I was being paranoid, I told myself again. It was just a strange night. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if it was the forest itself that felt wrong, or if it was something else, something hiding in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. I went back to the campfire, trying to keep busy. Cooking lunch, cleaning up, organizing my gear, anything to occupy my mind. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the mundane tasks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The forest felt too quiet again, too still. The wind had stopped completely, and the usual sounds of birds and small animals had quieted down. The silence was suffocating. Then I heard it again. The faintest sound. A soft crunch of dirt, almost too subtle to catch at first. But it was there. Something was moving around the perimeter of my camp. The footsteps, slow and deliberate. This time, I didn't even hesitate. I jumped up and grabbed the flashlight, my heart racing in my chest. I swung it around, scanning the trees, the brush, the shadows. But once again, there was nothing. No one. Just the empty forest. I stood there, trembling, the flashlight beam shaking in my hands. My breath was ragged as I searched the darkness for any sign of life. But all I found was the quiet, empty expanse of the woods around me. The footsteps had stopped. But I knew, just like the night before, that I wasn't alone. And now I had to wonder, what was out there? And what did it want with me? The days that followed only deepened the sense of unease that had settled in my chest. At first, I tried to push it aside, focusing on the beauty of the woods, the bird song in the morning, the crisp air that filled my lungs each time I stepped outside. I convinced myself that the strange happenings of the previous night were just my mind playing tricks on me, a product of too much solitude and too much quiet. But it didn't take long for the strange events to return, each one more persistent and more unsettling than the last. I woke up the next morning to find the campfire logs scattered across the ground. They had been neatly stacked the night before, but now they were all over the place. Some of them rolled just inches from my tent. I hadn't heard anything in the night. No one had been near the fire, at least not that I could recall. The only explanation I could come up with was that the wind had blown them around. But something about it felt wrong. The logs had been heavy. The wind wasn't strong enough to scatter them like that. I knelt down to pick them up, my hands trembling slightly as I rearranged them. That afternoon, I decided to go for another walk, hoping to clear my mind. The path was just as I had left it, but there was a distinct change in the air. The breeze, which had been so gentle the day before, now seemed to carry a sense of anticipation, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. The trees above rustled softly, their leaves brushing together in a rhythmic, almost deliberate way. As I walked deeper into the forest, I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. No one. Just the same trees and underbrush. I had to admit it, this wasn't my imagination. Something was following me. I picked up my pace, but the sounds behind me didn't stop. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, just the same shadowy expanse of the forest. But the sensation of being followed didn't go away. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever it was drawing closer. By the time I reached my campsite again, my heart was pounding. I had to stop myself from running. I told myself it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe it was the wind making noises in the brush. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. It was someone intent on staying just out of sight. That evening, I decided I wasn't going to let it win. I would stay out by the fire longer, keep myself busy, and not let the fear take hold. So I started to cook dinner, my back to the woods, doing everything I could to ignore the oppressive quiet settling over the camp. The fire crackled in front of me, throwing flickering shadows on the trees. The smell of cooking meat mixed with the scent of pine, but there was something off about the air. The woods felt too still, too watchful. My fingers trembled as I speared a piece of meat on a skewer, turning it over the fire. And then, just as I thought the night would pass without incident, I heard it again. That same soft crunching noise, like footsteps, moving slowly through the underbrush. This time, the sound was much closer, and it sent a chill down my spine. I slowly turned around, gripping the skewer in my hand like a weapon, my heart racing in my chest. The light from the fire barely reached the trees beyond the camp, but I scanned the dark edge of the forest anyway. There was nothing there. No shape, no movement. But I knew what I had heard. I stayed still, my breath shallow, listening intently for any sign of movement. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. It felt like the entire forest was waiting, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. For what felt like an eternity, nothing stirred. I finally let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned back to the fire. But the unease remained, gnawing at me from the inside out. I finished eating quickly, more out of necessity than hunger, and went inside my tent. The sounds of the forest continued, but they were distant now, muffled behind the fabric of the tent. I tried to focus on the warmth of my sleeping bag, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept racing, replaying the events of the night. The footsteps, the silence, the strange feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next day, I decided to take action. I couldn't keep ignoring the strange occurrences. If I was going to get to the bottom of whatever was happening, I needed to do something more than just sit around, hoping it would go away. So I packed my things and headed into the woods, determined to figure out what was going on. I started by walking the perimeter of the campsite, trying to find any clues that might explain what had been happening. I scanned the ground for footprints or signs of movement. It was no easy task. Most of the ground around the campsite was covered in thick underbrush, and the dirt was hard and compact, leaving little trace of anything that had passed through. But I kept looking, combing through the area with the precision of a detective. I had to find something. After an hour or so, I stumbled upon something that made my heart skip a beat. At the edge of the campsite, hidden under a fallen branch, I found a small patch of disturbed earth. The ground had been recently disturbed, like something or someone had been standing there, pressing their weight into the soil. I crouched down, examining the spot carefully, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were no clear footprints, but the way the earth had been pressed down suggested something had been standing there for a long time, watching. A sudden noise behind me made me jump, and I whipped around, expecting to see something or someone coming out of the trees. But again, there was nothing. Just the stillness of the forest. No one was there. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. It was impossible to ignore the growing sense that I was being hunted, but by what or who, I had no idea. The footprints, the disturbed earth, the footsteps in the night, it all pointed to something deliberate, something intelligent. But I couldn't figure out what. That night, I decided to stay awake. I would keep watch, no matter how long it took. I set up a small campfire just outside my tent and sat with my back against the tree, my eyes scanning the darkness. The fire flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the ground. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the damp earth, but the scent couldn't mask the tension that hung in the air. As the hours passed, the forest around me seemed to come alive. The occasional sound of an animal rustling in the leaves, the far-off calls of birds, the faint whispers of wind in the trees. But beneath all of it was that unshakable feeling, that feeling that something was moving just beyond the reach of the light, just out of sight. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. That soft, unmistakable crunch of footsteps. This time, it was much closer than before. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned my head toward the sound. The fire crackled, throwing its erratic light on the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no shape in the shadows. I waited, my breath held, the fear settling into my bones. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again. Closer. Slowly, deliberately. Whatever it was circling me. I could feel it, just beyond the edge of the firelight. But still, I saw nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The tension was unbearable. Whatever was out there, whatever had been stalking me for days, was drawing closer. And I had no idea how much longer I could keep pretending everything was fine. The footsteps stopped once again, and for a brief moment, everything seemed still. The forest was quiet, as if it had taken a collective breath, waiting for something. Then something moved in the shadows. A shape, a figure, just at the edge of the light. And it was coming toward me. The shape in the shadows loomed larger with each passing second. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in ragged bursts. I wanted to run, to flee from whatever was closing in on me, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The only sound that filled my ears was the frantic beat of my own heart, drowning out everything else, the crackling fire, the rustling leaves, even the wind, which had completely died down. The figure, if it was even a figure, moved with deliberate slowness, as though it wanted me to see it. It emerged from the trees, its form taking shape under the dim light of the fire. I couldn't quite make out what it was at first. The shadows distorted everything, making it difficult to distinguish between the trees and the thing that was standing just beyond them. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but when I opened my eyes, the shape was closer. My blood ran cold. It was a person, or at least it resembled one. But something was wrong. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as though it were not used to the motions of the human body. Its head tilted slightly to the side, its eyes black pits of nothingness. The face was pale, almost sickly, and I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. It wore ragged clothes that seemed to blend with the dark, making it appear like part of the forest itself. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice failed me. My mouth was dry, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward again, and I took a step back, instinctively raising the skewer I had used earlier to cook my meal, as though it could protect me. But I knew it was useless. There was no fight here. There was only survival. My mind raced through every possible scenario. What was this thing? Was it human? Was it something else? And, most terrifying of all, why was it here? The creature took another step, and then another, its feet making no sound on the forest floor. It was too quiet. I could hear the faintest rustling of leaves, but no footsteps. No crunching of twigs. It moved like it was gliding, like it wasn't even part of the world around it. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet here it was. In a split second, it was only a few feet from me, and I could smell it, an overwhelming stench of decay and something far worse, something I couldn't name. My stomach lurched. The air felt heavy, thick with something that didn't belong, like the entire forest had grown silent in its presence. It stopped, standing there just beyond the firelight, watching me. My eyes locked with the thing's, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Its eyes, those empty, dark voids, stared back at me, and I swear, for a moment, I saw something there. Something intelligent. Something aware. But it wasn't human. It couldn't be. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen in place, my legs stiff, my arms numb. I wanted to scream, but the air around me felt thick, as though something was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The creature's gaze never left me, its head tilting slightly, as if considering me. I didn't know how long we stood there like that, the fire crackling between us, the darkness pressing in around us. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, to do anything. But I couldn't. The creature didn't move either. It just stood there, watching. Then, without warning, it took a step forward. Just one, slow and deliberate, as though it had been waiting for me to react. My breath caught in my throat. I knew in that moment that whatever this thing was, it was not here by accident. It was here for a reason. It was here for me. The moment it stepped into the firelight, I could see it clearly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The thing's face, if you could even call it a face, was barely human. The skin was stretched too tightly, the features sharp and hollow. Its lips were thin and cracked, and the teeth that peeked out from behind them were jagged, like they belonged to some monstrous animal. The eyes were nothing but empty voids, black holes that swallowed all light, all hope. There was nothing in them but darkness. I stumbled backward, my legs finally responding to the panic coursing through me. I didn't care about the fire anymore. I didn't care about anything but getting away from this thing, from whatever it was. But before I could move, it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was a rasping sound, like something that had not spoken in years, its throat dry and cracked. The words were barely audible, but I caught them. "Leave!" The voice was so soft, so insistent, that it made my skin crawl. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. The fire flickered as I moved away from it, casting long, sharp shadows on the trees. My feet pounded against the forest floor, my breath ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had to get out of there. The sounds of my footsteps were drowned out by the thudding of my pulse in my ears. The branches seemed to reach out toward me as I ran, the underbrush growing thicker, more tangled. I could feel the presence of the thing behind me, just out of sight, but still there. I knew it was following me. I stumbled, my foot catching on something in the dark. I fell forward, my hands scraping against the ground. I pushed myself up and kept running, but now I could hear something else. Footsteps. Behind me. Not my own. Not the sound of my frantic escape. Something else was following me. I couldn't tell how long I had been running. My body was screaming for me to stop, but my fear kept pushing me forward, away from whatever that thing was, whatever it wanted. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care about the trees, the night, the silence that had returned to the woods. All I cared about was getting out of there. I don't know how long I ran before I finally collapsed, my breath ragged, my body trembling. My eyes were wide, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing but the cold, unfeeling forest around me. And that's when I realized I had left my campsite behind, my things scattered, abandoned. I was alone in the woods now, miles away from where I had started, and I had no idea what I was running from. But whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't human. It had never been human. I didn't stop running, not even after I could no longer hear the thing behind me. Every time I thought I might have lost it, the crunch of leaves underfoot would freeze me in my tracks. The realization hit me with a sickening wave. It wasn't a matter of if the thing would catch me, it was a matter of when. I stumbled through the darkened woods, my legs giving out beneath me with every step, but I forced myself onward. My mind was a haze, filled with nothing but the frantic need to escape. My body was exhausted, aching from the long sprint, but my fear kept me moving, kept me pushing forward. There was nothing else I could do. I didn't know how long I had been running. Hours, maybe. Time seemed to stretch and warp in that forest, as if the very trees themselves were conspiring to make sure I never found my way out. The darkness had swallowed me whole, and with each passing minute, I felt the weight of isolation pressing in on me. There were no sounds, no animals, no rustling leaves. It was as if the world around me had simply stopped. I finally collapsed against a tree, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. My legs were numb, my mind clouded by exhaustion. I closed my eyes, willing myself to calm down, to focus. But no matter how hard I tried, all I could see was that figure, the pale, twisted thing watching me with those empty, dark eyes. I could still smell the decay, still feel the weight of its gaze. How had it followed me? Why? And most terrifying of all, where had it gone? It couldn't have just disappeared. As I sat there, staring into the pitch-black woods, I realized something else. I had no idea where I was. The forest was unfamiliar, the landscape completely alien. In my frantic flight, I had lost all sense of direction. I could have been miles away from my campsite, or worse, I could have circled back, trapped in an endless loop, forever lost in this cursed place. I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it would find me if I did. Summoning every last ounce of strength, I pushed myself to my feet. My legs felt like jelly, but I managed to stagger forward. I knew I had to find my way back to the road, back to civilization. The woods had already claimed so much of my sanity, I couldn't let them take any more. I took one step, then another, my eyes scanning the dark as I tried to keep my bearings. But everything felt wrong. The trees looked unfamiliar, their twisted branches reaching out toward me like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay, as though the forest itself had come alive, urging me deeper into its grasp. It wasn't long before I realized I had made a mistake. I had taken a wrong turn. What had seemed like the right path only moments before now stretched endlessly ahead, winding deeper into the forest. I could feel panic rising in my chest again, threatening to overtake me, but I pushed it back. I had to think. I couldn't let fear control me. I stopped and tried to retrace my steps. But the forest, with its endless maze of trees, didn't make it easy. I had no landmarks, no reference points. I couldn't tell which direction I had come from, let alone where I needed to go. The silence weighed heavily on me. There were no crickets chirping, no rustling of leaves, no night sounds. Just the oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. And then, out of nowhere, I heard something. A twig snapped behind me. My heart stopped in my chest. I whirled around, my body tensing, my breath caught in my throat. But there was nothing. Nothing but the dark, empty woods. I tried to calm myself, but the unease lingered, like a cold hand pressing against my chest. I knew I had to keep moving. I couldn't stay here, not even for a second. I pressed on, my steps quickening as I walked, then jogged, then ran. My mind raced with questions, none of which had answers. What was it? What did it want from me? Why had it come after me? And most chilling of all, was it still out there? Was it still watching me? I don't know how long I was lost in those woods. Time felt like it had stretched into infinity. But after what seemed like an eternity, I saw something ahead, lights. Bright, welcoming lights. It was the road. I had found the road. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the stillness, louder than they should have been. When I finally stepped onto the pavement, I felt a sense of relief so profound that I almost collapsed right then and there. But as I stood there, taking in deep breaths of fresh air, something made me pause. It was that feeling again, that nagging sense that I wasn't truly alone. I turned back toward the woods, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the trees, its black eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Something was out there, just beyond the reach of the road's lights. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how many steps I took away from the forest, I would never truly be free of it. I didn't look back as I walked toward the nearest town, my steps quickening with each passing moment. I didn't stop to rest, didn't allow myself to be distracted. All that mattered was getting away, getting as far from that place as I possibly could. But even now, as I sit here telling you this story, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. And I know deep down that whatever it was that followed me through those woods, it's not finished with me yet. And I don't think it ever will be. The forest doesn't forget. It never forgets. And it always comes back. I've since learned that others have encountered strange, unsettling things in those same woods. Things they can't explain, things they don't talk about much. Locals whisper about the area, their voices lowering whenever it comes up. I didn't understand why, back then, but now I do. The woods, that place, it has a reputation, a history that people want to keep buried. They speak of it in hushed tones, as though speaking too loudly might draw attention from whatever lurks within. I've tried to distance myself from it, to move on with my life. But the memory still haunts me. Every time I close my eyes, I can see that twisted figure, its hollow eyes staring back at me. I can feel the weight of its gaze, the terror that gripped me when I realized I wasn't alone. I can't escape it. I remember the night I finally came back to my senses after fleeing the woods, lying in my bed, wide awake. The sound of my heartbeat was deafening in the silence of my room. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made me tense up. I kept imagining that whatever had followed me would find its way to my door, that it would wait for me, watching, just like it had in the woods. But even more chilling than the thoughts racing through my mind was the overwhelming sense of knowing. It was as if that thing had marked me, left some sort of invisible trace, a tether that couldn't be severed. It was a feeling that stayed with me, clinging to me long after the night had passed. I've told a few people about what happened, but no one believes me. How could they? What happened in those woods doesn't fit into the neat, logical world we live in. They hear the fear in my voice, see the hesitation in my eyes, and chalk it up to stress or a vivid nightmare. But they don't understand. They weren't there. No one else has seen the things I've seen, felt the terror I felt. I envy them in a way. Their lives continue on, untouched by the dread that follows me. I wish I could be like them, free from the constant awareness that something is out there, watching, waiting. But deep down, I know that I'll never be free. That thing in the woods, whatever it was, still has a hold on me. Even as I try to live a normal life, I can't escape the feeling that I'm being watched. Every time I venture into the woods, whether it's for work, for a hike, or just for some fresh air, I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I can hear the leaves rustling, the twigs snapping, and I can't shake the feeling that it's out there, just beyond my sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. It's a sensation that has become part of my everyday existence, a constant companion. I'll be walking down the street, and for a split second, I'll catch the shadow of something moving in the corner of my eye, a shape that vanishes the moment I turn my head. I'll hear footsteps behind me, echoing in the empty street, but when I turn around, there's no one there. The world is full of these little moments that make me question my sanity, that make me wonder if I'll ever truly be rid of whatever it was that followed me. I've thought about going back to those woods, about confronting whatever it was that haunted me. Maybe if I faced it again, I could put the fear to rest. But every time that thought crosses my mind, I'm reminded of the feeling I had when I fled. The raw, gut-wrenching terror that made it impossible to think, to act rationally. I can still feel it in my chest, a constant tightness, a knot that refuses to loosen. And every time I think of returning, I realize that I could never go back. That place, those woods, are not something to be reckoned with. So I live with the memory of it, the unshakable knowledge that I was not alone that night, that something otherworldly, something ancient, stalks those woods. I live with the feeling that I've crossed paths with something that doesn't belong in this world, something that has now marked me, following me through life like a shadow I can't outrun. I don't know if I'll ever find peace. Maybe I will. Maybe time will dull the edges of the fear. But for now, the terror that began in those woods lingers, a reminder that not everything can be explained, not everything can be understood. Some things are just beyond us, waiting in the dark corners of the world, biding their time. And so, I leave you with this. If you ever find yourself in those woods, if you ever feel the hairs on the back of your neck, stand up. If you hear footsteps behind you but see nothing, know this sometimes. It's better not to know what's out there. Some things are better left alone, hidden in the dark where they can't reach you. And if you listen closely, you might just hear it. That faint rustle in the trees, the soft crunch of leaves beneath invisible feet. It might just be a breeze, or it might be something far worse. I can't say for sure. This is a story about a delivery driver who found himself trapped in a place where time seemed to stand still. It was just an ordinary evening, at least. That's how I remember it. I had worked as a delivery driver for a few years, driving long hours through the night, navigating city streets with an ease that comes with the job. But that night, something was different. I had taken on an extra shift, hoping to make a little more money before the end of the week. It was supposed to be just another routine delivery. Little did I know that it would turn into a night I'd never forget. The warehouse I was assigned to wasn't far from the city. The roads leading there were lined with shadows and empty buildings, but it wasn't unusual. I'd made deliveries to places like this many times before, old industrial areas that had long since been forgotten by the bustling city around them. The company I worked for had regular clients in these parts, and my route tonight was no different. Or so I thought. The warehouse I was headed to was big, massive actually. It stood alone, isolated from the rest of the buildings in the area. As I pulled up to the entrance, I could already feel an odd sense of unease creeping up my spine. The place was dark, with no lights on, except for the faint glow of an overhead bulb near the door. The sign on the front was worn, the letters barely legible. There was no name or logo, just a vague sense of abandonment. I checked my delivery instructions. Everything seemed normal. The place was supposed to be open, but as I pulled into the lot and parked, something felt off. I had made deliveries here before, but never at night. The silence was deafening. It wasn't the usual hum of industry. I was used to no workers, no sounds of machinery, nothing. Just the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the hum of my truck's engine idling. I grabbed the package from the passenger seat, double-checked the address on the label, and stepped out of the truck. The cold air hit me immediately, sending a shiver down my spine. I could feel the weight of the night pressing in around me. The warehouse loomed in front of me, its rusted metal exterior reflecting the dull light from the overhead bulb. The door was ajar, slightly swinging with the breeze. I hesitated, my eyes scanning the surroundings, but then I shrugged it off. After all, it was just another delivery. Nothing to be afraid of. I walked toward the door, each step echoing in the empty lot. As I approached, the door creaked slightly as it opened more, as if inviting me in. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. My first instinct was to knock, but there was no answer, no movement from inside. The place seemed deserted. I pushed the door open, half expecting a greeting of some kind, but the silence that greeted me was unnerving. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with old crates and boxes. The dim light from the bulb above barely illuminated the space, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find abandoned, forgotten by time, and left to decay. I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls, but no one responded. The package I was holding felt heavier in my hands now, and the further I stepped into the building, the more uneasy I became. Something about the place felt wrong. There was no sign of life, no hint of activity. Just silence, thick and heavy. I looked around, trying to make sense of the emptiness. It was clear that no one had worked here in years. The machinery was rusted and covered in grime. The air was musty, filled with the smell of old wood and metal. I could hear the faint sound of my boots tapping against the concrete floor, each step growing more unsettling as I ventured deeper into the building. The door behind me slowly creaked shut, and I froze for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just the wind or some old mechanism inside the building reacting to the temperature change. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling that was beginning to settle in my chest. I walked further into the warehouse, searching for any sign of life. There had to be someone here to accept the package, right? But with each passing moment, my doubt grew. It was becoming more apparent that the warehouse wasn't just abandoned, it felt forgotten, abandoned in a way that didn't seem natural. It was as if the place itself had been left behind by time, standing still, waiting for something. Or someone. As I moved through the aisles, I noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols and graffiti that didn't look like anything I had seen before. They weren't the usual tags or scribbles from vandals. These looked more deliberate, more old. Some of them were drawn in red, like some kind of warning. The longer I looked at them, the more uneasy I felt. It was like the walls themselves were watching me. I quickly turned away, hoping to push the thought from my mind. I needed to focus on the job. But as I continued to walk through the maze of crates and boxes, I felt as though I was being watched. The temperature seemed to drop with each step I took, and the shadows seemed to shift around me. My breath came in shallow bursts as I searched for the delivery point. It wasn't long before I realized I had no idea where I was. The warehouse was like a labyrinth, and I was lost inside it. The further I walked into the warehouse, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like a blanket smothering every noise I made. The soft scuff of my boots on the concrete floor was the only sound breaking the eerie stillness, but even that seemed muted, swallowed by the sheer vastness of the space. The package in my hand felt like a lead weight, though it couldn't have been more than a few pounds. I told myself I'd just drop it off and get out of there as quickly as possible. But then, the first strange thing happened. I heard it, a faint sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum. At first, I thought it might be machinery, old pipes groaning, maybe. But as I stood there, straining to listen, the noise grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't mechanical. It was rhythmic, like someone humming a tune, but off-key. It came from somewhere deep within the warehouse. I froze, my body stiffening instinctively. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing into the void. There was no response, only that eerie humming. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to bounce off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. For a moment, I considered leaving, dropping the package right there on the floor and walking out. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride I didn't want to admit that I was scared, or maybe it was the gnawing curiosity that had started to take root. Either way, I took a deep breath, steadied my nerves, and pressed on. As I moved further into the warehouse, the humming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. It was so complete, so unnatural, that it felt as though the entire building was holding its breath. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse quicken. The logical part of my brain told me it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the primal part of me, the part that senses danger before it can be rationalized, screamed at me to turn back. I ignored it. I kept walking, my eyes scanning the dimly lit aisles for any sign of movement. The light from my phone's screen provided little comfort, barely cutting through the darkness. The warehouse seemed to stretch on forever, a maze of towering shelves and crates that all looked the same. Then I saw it. A shadow. It was quick, darting across the far end of the aisle, barely visible in the faint glow of the overhead bulb. My heart jumped into my throat, and I stopped in my tracks, clutching the package tighter. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" "Silence!" I swallowed hard, my eyes fixed on the spot where the shadow had disappeared. It could have been anything, a trick of the light, an animal, maybe even another person. But the way it moved didn't feel natural. It was too fast, too deliberate. I took a hesitant step forward, my palms slick with sweat. "Look, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just need to drop this off and leave." No response. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just that suffocating silence and the faint flicker of the overhead light. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself. "Just get it over with." But as I turned to walk away, something stopped me dead in my tracks. A laugh. Soft, faint, and chilling. It was barely audible, more like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was there. And it wasn't friendly. My blood ran cold, and my grip on the package tightened to the point where my knuckles turned white. I spun around, my eyes darting frantically across the empty aisle. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The laugh stopped, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to drop the package and run. But my legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the spot by a mix of fear and disbelief. That's when I noticed something else. The markings on the walls. I had seen them earlier, but now they seemed different. The symbols, faint and faded before, appeared brighter, more vivid. It was as if they were glowing faintly in the dim light, pulsating with an almost imperceptible energy. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at them, the strange shapes and patterns twisting and shifting in a way that made my head spin. They weren't just random graffiti. They meant something. I turned away, unwilling to look at them any longer. But as I did, I saw something even more disturbing. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading away from me and deeper into the warehouse. The prints were strange, too large to belong to any person, yet they had the unmistakable shape of a human foot. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed them with my eyes, trying to see where they led. But they disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the shadows. For the first time that night, I seriously considered leaving. Forget the delivery, forget the job, it wasn't worth it. But as I turned toward the exit, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door. The door I had entered through, the one I was sure I had left slightly ajar, was now shut tight. I felt a wave of panic wash over me as I rushed toward it, the package forgotten in my hand. I reached out and grabbed the handle, yanking it hard. It didn't budge. I pulled again, harder this time, but it was no use. The door wouldn't move, as if it had been locked from the outside. Panic turned to dread as I realized I was trapped. I turned around, my back pressed against the cold metal of the door, my eyes scanning the dark expanse of the warehouse. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, closing in around me. I could feel it now, something watching me, something waiting. And for the first time that night, I realized that I wasn't alone. The silence in the warehouse wasn't just a lack of sound anymore, it felt alive. Every creak of the steel beams, every flicker of the overhead light, every echo of my footsteps seemed amplified, feeding the growing sense of dread that gnawed at the edge of my thoughts. The door behind me was still immovable, and the realization that I couldn't leave sent a shiver through my entire body. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The footprints I had seen earlier lingered in my mind, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Were they leading me somewhere? Or away from something? Either way, I wasn't about to stand still and let the fear paralyze me. I started moving deeper into the warehouse. My phone's flashlight carved a narrow path through the oppressive darkness, but the beam felt weaker than it should have been, as if the shadows were swallowing its light. The air grew colder the further I walked, a sharp contrast to the mild night outside. Then it happened again. That sound. Not the laugh this time, but the humming. It was louder now, clearer, and more unsettling. It wasn't a tune, not really, just a series of low, uneven notes that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It came from somewhere off to my right, beyond a row of towering metal shelves stacked with crates. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. I swallowed hard and made my way toward the sound, my footsteps cautious, deliberate. As I approached the end of the aisle, I noticed something strange on the floor. A faint smear of what looked like dirt, or maybe it was something else. It led around the corner, disappearing into the darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I forced myself to keep going. I turned the corner, my heart pounding, and froze. The humming stopped. In its place was a low, guttural sound, like breathing but not human. It was uneven, labored, and seemed to echo off the walls. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something just ahead, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. A figure! At first, I thought it was a person, maybe another worker or someone playing a prank, but as I stepped closer, I realized how wrong I was. The figure was hunched over, its back turned to me. It was too tall, its limbs too long and thin. Its skin, or whatever it was, looked pale and almost translucent in the light. It moved slightly, a jerky, unnatural motion, as if it didn't quite know how to use its own body. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure stopped moving, and then, slowly, it turned its head. I didn't wait to see its face. The sheer wrongness of its movements, the way it twisted its neck, was enough to send me running in the opposite direction. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The sound of my boots pounding against the concrete floor echoed through the warehouse, mingling with the sharp, metallic clang of something heavy falling behind me. I didn't look back. I turned corner after corner, the maze of shelves and crates becoming more disorienting with every step. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker, and my phone's battery icon flashed red. No, 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 I muttered, shaking it as if that would help. The light sputtered out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I stopped running, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My fingers fumbled with the phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but it wouldn't respond. The darkness pressed in around me, so thick it felt almost tangible. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and not my own. They came from somewhere behind me, growing louder, closer. I pressed myself against the side of a metal shelf, my hands trembling as I searched for anything I could use as a weapon. My fingers closed around a rusted metal pipe, and I gripped it tightly, the cold steel biting into my palm. The footsteps stopped. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. And then, a voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. "You don't belong here." I swung the pipe blindly in the direction of the voice, but it connected with nothing. The echo of the swing felt too loud in the empty space, and I stumbled forward, my heart racing. I needed to find a way out. I ran again, the sound of my own footsteps blending with the phantom echoes around me. The warehouse seemed endless, each aisle looking the same as the last, the towering shelves casting long, menacing shadows. And then I saw it, a faint light up ahead. Hope surged through me as I sprinted toward it, the pipe still clutched in my hand. The light grew brighter as I approached, and I realized it was coming from a small office tucked into the corner of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar, the glow spilling out into the darkness like a beacon. I burst into the office, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. The room was small and cluttered, filled with old filing cabinets, a desk, and a flickering fluorescent light. My eyes scanned the space, searching for anything useful. On the desk was a stack of papers, yellowed with age, and a small, outdated computer. The screen was on, displaying a black and white security feed of the warehouse. My stomach sank as I watched the grainy footage. There was movement. The cameras showed multiple angles of the warehouse, each one capturing the same figure I had seen earlier. It was moving through the aisles, its jerky, unnatural movements sending chills down my spine. And then, as I watched, it stopped. It turned its head, looking directly at one of the cameras. At me. I backed away from the desk, my mind racing. How did it know where I was? I glanced around the room, searching for another way out, but there was nothing, just the locked door and the small, barred window. The figure on the screen moved again, this time heading straight for the office. The lights in the room flickered, the fluorescent bulb buzzing angrily before plunging the space into darkness. I was left alone with the faint glow of the computer screen and the sound of something scratching at the door. My grip on the pipe tightened as the scratching grew louder, more insistent. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. And then, the door handle started to turn. The doorknob turned slowly, accompanied by a faint, metallic creak that seemed to echo louder than any sound I had ever heard. My whole body froze as I stared at the handle, willing it to stop. But it didn't. Something was on the other side of the door, and it wasn't in a hurry. My grip tightened around the rusted pipe in my hand, its weight grounding me in the moment. The door jolted once, then twice, as if the thing outside was testing its resistance. I stepped back, my mind racing through every possible option. There weren't many. The window was too small to escape through, and the bars made it impossible to break. The desk and filing cabinets offered no real protection, just clutter that boxed me in. Then, The scratching returned. It was deliberate, almost methodical, as if whatever was outside knew exactly how to fray my nerves. Long, dragging scratches trailed across the wooden surface of the door, followed by a low, guttural sound that sent chills rippling through me. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The sound stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, when the door suddenly jolted with a deafening bang. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the pipe. The door shook violently as something slammed into it from the other side, over and over, each impact more forceful than the last. The flimsy lock wouldn't hold for long. And then I saw it. Through the narrow crack between the door and its frame, something slid into view. A hand, but it wasn't human. Its fingers were unnaturally long and thin, with sharp claw-like nails that gleamed faintly in the dim light. The skin was a sickly gray, mottled and almost translucent, like something decayed. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat as the clawed hand groped blindly for the lock. It moved with purpose, as if it understood exactly what it was doing. "No, no, no," I muttered under my breath, gripping the pipe so tightly that my knuckles turned white. With a final, sickening screech, the lock gave way and the door burst open. The figure stood in the doorway, its full form illuminated by the faint light from the computer screen. It was taller than I had realized, its skeletal frame stretching upward like something that didn't belong in this world. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull the light out of the room. I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the edge of the desk. The creature stepped inside, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. It didn't answer. It didn't need to. The oppressive presence it carried spoke volumes, filling the room with an unbearable weight. My survival instincts kicked in. Without thinking, I swung the pipe as hard as I could. The metal connected with its arm, and a sickening crack echoed through the room. But the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it turned its head toward me, its mouth, if it could be called that, twisting into a grotesque semblance of a smile. Rows of jagged, yellowed teeth glinted in the dim light, and a low, guttural noise rumbled from its throat, something between a growl and a laugh. I swung again, this time aiming for its head, but it moved faster than anything I'd ever seen. In an instant, it was on me, its clawed hand wrapping around my wrist with an iron grip. The pipe clattered to the floor as I cried out in pain, the claws digging into my skin. The creature leaned closer, its face inches from mine. The stench of decay was overwhelming, and I struggled to breathe as its hollow eyes bored into me. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I kicked out desperately, my foot connecting with its leg. The creature released me with a snarl, and I scrambled backward, grabbing the first thing my hand touched, a heavy stapler from the desk. I hurled it at the creature's head, and while it didn't seem to hurt it, the impact was enough to buy me a few precious seconds. I bolted for the door, my adrenaline overriding the searing pain in my wrist. The hallway stretched out before me like a nightmare, the flickering lights casting long, distorted shadows. I didn't look back. The sound of the creature's footsteps echoed behind me, faster now, more urgent. It was hunting me. I turned corner after corner, my lungs burning as I pushed myself to keep moving. The layout of the warehouse, once a confusing maze, was now a death trap. Every aisle looked the same. Every turn led to more darkness. Then, up ahead, I saw at the door. The main entrance loomed in the distance, its outline barely visible in the faint light. My heart leapt with a mix of hope and desperation as I sprinted toward it, my legs threatening to give out. But as I reached the door, I realized something was wrong. The chains. The heavy chains I had seen earlier were no longer wrapped around the handles. Instead, they lay on the ground in a tangled heap, as if someone or something had removed them. I didn't have time to question it. I grabbed the handles and pulled with all my strength, but the door wouldn't budge. It was stuck, jammed shut by something unseen. Behind me, the sound of the creature's footsteps grew louder, closer. Come on, come on, I shouted, slamming my shoulder against the door in desperation. And then I felt it. A hand cold, skeletal, and impossibly strong closed around my shoulder. I turned, my scream caught in my throat as I came face to face with the creature. It loomed over me, its hollow eyes filled with a darkness that seemed to stretch into eternity. Its mouth twisted into that grotesque smile again, and it leaned in closer, its breath like ice against my skin. You were warned, it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. Before I could react, it raised its other hand, the claws gleaming in the dim light. And then, everything went black. I don't remember what happened next. When I came to, I was lying outside the warehouse, the cool night air brushing against my face. The chains were back on the door, wrapped tightly around the handles, as if they had never been removed. But the claw marks on my wrist told me it wasn't a dream. When I opened my eyes, the sky above was a muted gray, signaling the first hints of dawn. The cool, damp air of the early morning stung my lungs as I took a shaky breath, struggling to make sense of where I was. My body ached all over, my legs felt like they had run for miles, and my shoulder throbbed where the creature had grabbed me. I was lying just outside the warehouse, on the cracked pavement of the parking lot. The massive structure loomed behind me, its shadow stretching across the ground like a dark omen. The chains on the main entrance were back in place, wrapped tightly around the handles and secured with the same heavy padlock I had seen before. It was as if the events of the night had been erased, leaving no evidence of the horror inside, except for the marks on my wrist. I sat up slowly, wincing as the raw, red gashes from the creature's claws came into view. The skin was torn and tender, the wounds too real to dismiss as some bizarre hallucination. My van was still parked where I had left it, the engine cold and the doors locked. Somehow, I still had the keys in my pocket, though I didn't remember grabbing them. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door and climbed inside, shutting and locking it behind me as if the thin metal walls of the vehicle could offer any real protection. For several minutes, I just sat there, staring blankly at the steering wheel. My mind replayed the events of the night in a disjointed loop, the footsteps, the clawed hand, the door bursting open. The creature's voice, low and guttural, echoed in my head. You were warned. What had it meant? Warned about what? And who or what had put those chains back on the door? I glanced at the warehouse, half expecting to see the creature watching me from one of the broken windows. But there was nothing. Just the dark, silent building, its secrets locked away once again. I started the engine, the familiar rumble of the van bringing a small measure of comfort. My hands still shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the worn leather. I didn't dare look back as I pulled out of the parking lot, my headlights cutting through the early morning mist. The drive home felt surreal, like moving through a waking dream. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional early riser or delivery truck. Everything felt normal again, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the events of the night had followed me in some intangible way. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion washing over me in waves. My phone was still in my pocket, its battery nearly dead. I pulled it out, half expecting to see missed calls or messages from the warehouse manager or my supervisor, but there was nothing. Had anyone else experienced what I did? Or was I the only one? Over the next few days, I tried to piece together what had happened. I searched online for any news about the warehouse reports of strange occurrences, unexplained events, anything that could validate my experience. But there was nothing. The delivery was never brought up again. My supervisor didn't mention it, and the warehouse manager never called to ask why the package hadn't been delivered. It was as if the job had never existed. I considered going back to the warehouse to see if I could find answers, but the thought of stepping foot inside that place again made my blood run cold. I couldn't bring myself to do it. The claw marks on my wrists began to heal, but they left behind faint scars, a permanent reminder of the encounter. I started wearing long sleeves to cover them, not wanting to answer the inevitable questions from coworkers or friends. I also began to notice strange things in my apartment. Shadows seemed to linger a little too long in the corners of the room. The faint sound of scratching, like nails on wood, sometimes woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, the lingering effects of a traumatic experience. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. I decided to reach out to one of the older delivery drivers at the company, someone who had been around long enough to know the ins and outs of every warehouse and route. I approached him during a lunch break, careful to frame my questions casually. "Hey, have you ever delivered to that old warehouse on Ridgewood?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. The man's expression changed instantly. His easy smile faded, replaced by a look of discomfort, or was it fear? He set down his sandwich and leaned in closer. "Ridgewood," he said quietly. "You stay away from that place, you hear me? Nothing good ever comes from going there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Why? What do you mean?" He shook his head, his eyes darting around the break room as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "Look, I don't know what goes on in that place, and I don't want to know. All I know is it's bad news. People who've delivered there, well, let's just say they don't stick around here long." I pressed him for more details, but he wouldn't say anything else. He just gave me a hard look and said, "Stay away," before getting up and walking out of the room. I took his warning to heart. I quit the delivery job soon after, citing stress and the need for a change of pace. But even after leaving, I couldn't shake the feeling that the warehouse wasn't done with me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that guttural voice in my dreams. "You were warned." I wake up drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of clawed fingers gripping my shoulder. And every so often, when I glance at the faint scars on my wrist, I feel a presence watching, waiting. I don't know what I encountered that night, and maybe it's better that way. Some questions are best left unanswered. But one thing is certain, I'll never forget the warehouse on Ridgewood. And if you ever find yourself there, alone in the dark, I hope you heed the warning I didn't. It's been months since that night at the Ridgewood warehouse, but its shadow still lingers over my life. Every so often, when I catch a glimpse of my reflection or sit quietly in the stillness of my apartment, I think about how close I came to something unexplainable, something far darker than anything I could have imagined in my most vivid nightmares. I've tried to return to normal life, but normal feels like a distant memory. The claw marks on my wrist have faded to faint scars, but they're a constant reminder of the horror that unfolded in that forsaken building. They feel like an unspoken bond, a mark left by something I can't fully understand but will never escape. I often wonder about the warehouse itself. Who or what placed those chains on the doors? Why had I been the one sent to deliver that package? And why was it never spoken of again? These questions loop in my mind, unanswered and haunting. I've come to believe that the warehouse isn't just a building. It's something alive, something that draws people in and traps them in its web. I wasn't the first, and I probably won't be the last. The older delivery driver's warning echoes in my mind often. Stay away from that place. But there's one thought that scares me more than anything else. What if the warehouse wasn't just a trap? What if it was a test? Fear has a way of staying with you, of reshaping how you view the world. Before that night, my biggest worries were ordinary paying bills, making deadlines, dealing with traffic. Now, those worries seem trivial in comparison to the terror of facing something beyond human understanding. When I think back to the creature's word, "You were warned," I feel a cold knot of dread in my chest. Was it trying to scare me? Or was it warning me in its own twisted way about something worse? Something still waiting, biding its time? I've spoken to no one about what happened, except for the older driver who warned me off. How could I? People would think I'd lost my mind, and maybe they'd be right. But some nights, when the world is quiet, I think I hear faint scratching noises coming from the walls of my apartment. It's faint, barely there, but it sets my teeth on edge. I know what you're thinking, it's just paranoia, just the after effects of trauma. Maybe it is, but maybe it's something more. This happened to me almost a decade ago, back when I was driving a cab full-time in a small but busy city. The kind of place where streets were always humming with life, even at odd hours. I'm not going to give you the exact name of the town, but picture a mix of quiet suburban neighborhoods and a downtown filled with old brick buildings that have seen better days. Driving a cab wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me the flexibility I needed. My routine was pretty straightforward: pick up passengers, make small talk, or not, depending on the vibe, and drop them off where they needed to go. It was honest work, and most days were uneventful. I usually worked the late-night shift. Something about the quiet hum of the city at night felt calming, even when the occasional rowdy bar crowd stumbled into the back seat. There was a rhythm to it. Pull up to a dark curb, watch the passenger climb in, listen to their tired or tipsy chatter, and then move on to the next ride. Back then, I drove a beat-up, dark green sedan. There wasn't much to look at, but it got the job done. The interior had that faint smell of old upholstery mixed with air freshener, and the dashboard lights gave off a dim orange glow that made the cabin feel oddly cozy during those long nights. I didn't mind the solitude of driving at night. The streets were quieter, the passengers fewer, and there was something comforting about the predictable monotony. I had my favorite routes, too, the long, empty roads that took you past the outskirts of town, where the streetlights thinned out and the darkness seemed to stretch forever. It was on one of those quiet, uneventful nights that this story begins. It was a Thursday, a little after midnight. The weather was cold, the kind that bites at your skin even when you're bundled up. I remember checking the time on the clock above my radio, 12:17 a.m. The streets were practically deserted, save for the occasional car that zipped by in a hurry to get somewhere. I had just dropped off a passenger at a 24-hour diner on the edge of downtown and was heading back toward the center of town to pick up another fare. My next ride came through on the app, a passenger who needed a pickup near an industrial area on the west side of town. It wasn't a popular spot, especially at that hour, but I wasn't one to turn down a job. When I arrived at the location, it was quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. The kind of quiet that makes you suddenly aware of every little sound around you, the hum of the car engine, the faint rustling of leaves in the cold wind, and even the soft creak of the car door as you lean out to get a better look at your surroundings. The industrial area wasn't completely abandoned, but most of the warehouses were dark. There were no streetlights here, just the glow of my car's headlights cutting through the shadows. I scanned the area, looking for my passenger. For a moment, I thought they might have canceled the ride because no one was in sight. And then I saw him. He was standing just a little ways off, near the edge of the parking lot, under the faint glow of a distant security light. He wasn't moving, just standing there like he was waiting for something, or someone. I couldn't make out his face clearly from where I was, but his posture struck me as odd. He was stiff, almost rigid, like he was frozen in place. He wore a long coat, dark enough to blend into the night, and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. For a split second, I hesitated. There was something about the way he stood there that felt wrong. But work was work. I pulled up a little closer, rolled down the passenger side window, and called out, "You need a ride?" He didn't respond right away. He just stood there for a moment longer before finally moving toward the car. The way he walked was slow and deliberate, like every step was calculated. When he reached the car, he opened the back door and slid in without a word. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at his face. It was partially hidden in the shadows of his hat, but I could see enough to tell he was older, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s. His skin was pale, and there was something unsettling about his eyes. They looked empty. "Where to?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back into the seat, his gaze fixed on something in the distance through the window. Finally, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, he said, "Just drive." When he said, "Just drive," I assumed he needed time to gather his thoughts. Maybe he was distracted or tired. Nighttime passengers can be like that, quiet, lost in their own worlds. It wasn't unusual, so I did as he asked. I eased the car out of the parking lot, the tires crunching softly against the loose gravel, and headed toward the nearest main road. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence in the car started to feel heavy. Most passengers, even the quiet ones, usually give some direction after a few minutes. A cross street, a landmark, something. But this man? Nothing. He just sat there in the back seat, staring out the window. The first sign that something was off happened maybe 5 minutes into the ride. I'd taken a right onto one of the main roads, figuring he'd eventually tell me where he wanted to go. As we drove, I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His face was turned toward the window, but it didn't seem like he was looking at the streetlights or the passing cars. It was more like he was looking at nothing. Then he did something that made my stomach tighten. Without turning his head, he said in that same quiet voice, "You're going the wrong way." His words caught me off guard. I instinctively tapped the brakes, the car slowing slightly as I processed what he'd just said. Sorry about that," I replied. "Where do you want me to go?" He didn't answer. I glanced back in the rearview mirror again. This time, he was staring directly at me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something unnerving about his gaze, like he wasn't just looking at me, but through me. "Okay," I said, forcing a nervous laugh. "Just let me know where you need to be, and I'll get you there." For a moment, he didn't respond. He just kept staring, unblinking, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "Keep driving," he said. I nodded, trying to play it cool. "Sure thing. Let me know if you want me to take a specific turn." The man didn't say anything else. He turned his head back toward the window, and the car fell into silence again. But it wasn't the comfortable kind of silence I was used to during late-night rides. This was different. The air in the car felt tense, almost oppressive, like the weight of his presence was pressing down on me. As we drove, I started to notice other small, strange things. The way he was sitting, for one. Most people lean back in their seats, relax a little, maybe shift around if the ride gets long. But he sat perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his posture unnaturally straight. It was like he was frozen in place, as if even the act of moving might break some invisible rule he was following. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. It was late, I told myself. Maybe I was just tired and letting my imagination get the better of me. But then, something else happened. We'd been driving for about 10 minutes when the man suddenly leaned forward. I saw the movement in the mirror, and it made my heart skip a beat. His face was still partially hidden in the shadow of his hat, but I could see enough to tell that he was watching me closely. "Do you believe in?" He paused, as if searching for the right word. "The unknown?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. I guess it depends on what you mean by unknown," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Why do you ask?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back into his seat, his gaze shifting once again to the window. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my palms suddenly slick with sweat. There was something about the way he'd asked the question that sent a ripple of unease through me. The rest of the ride continued in near silence, save for the faint hum of the car engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires when we passed over an uneven patch of road. But then came the second strange moment. As we approached an intersection, I slowed down, waiting for the traffic light to change. The intersection wasn't busy, just a few cars here and there, but I noticed something unusual. There was a man standing on the corner, dressed in a similar long coat and hat. At first, I didn't think much of it. Late-night pedestrians weren't uncommon. But then I noticed how he was standing perfectly still, just like my passenger had been when I first saw him. The light turned green, and I hesitated for a split second before pressing the gas. As we passed the intersection, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting the man on the corner to turn and walk away. He didn't. He just stood there, his head slightly tilted, as if he were watching the car disappear into the distance. And that's when my passenger spoke again. "Do you ever feel like you're being watched?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I forced a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. "Sometimes, yeah. Comes with the job, I guess. You meet all kinds of people driving a cab." He didn't respond. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror again. He was still sitting perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the window. But something about the way he sat there felt different now, like he was waiting for something. The unease that had been building in my chest since the start of the ride was now a full-blown knot in my stomach. I wanted to ask him again where he wanted to go, but something stopped me. It was the way he'd said that last sentence. The way his voice had carried an almost imperceptible hint of satisfaction. Like he knew something I didn't. The rest of the ride passed in an uneasy silence. The unease that had crept into the car during the first leg of the ride quickly grew into something far heavier, far darker. I've had my share of strange passengers before, ones who were drunk, chatty, or even downright rude. But this was different. There was something about this man, his demeanor, his silence, that began to gnaw at me in a way I couldn't shake. The road stretched ahead, illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights, but it felt as though we were driving into an abyss. The night had a peculiar stillness, one that wasn't natural. Even the sounds of the city, normally so persistent, so alive, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the faint hum of my engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the pavement. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, stealing a look at him. He hadn't moved from his rigid position. His hat cast a shadow over most of his face, but I could see the faint glint of his eyes reflecting the light. They were open, unblinking, and fixed straight ahead, as if he were staring at something I couldn't see. I decided to break the silence, mostly for my own sanity. "Hey, buddy, you're gonna have to give me something here. A street name, a landmark, anything." My voice wavered slightly, betraying the tension I felt. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward again, just slightly, enough that I could see more of his face in the mirror. His expression was blank, devoid of any emotion. Then he said, in that same low, calm voice, "Turn left." I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more unnerved. At least he'd given me some kind of direction, though the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I took the next left, which led us onto a narrower road lined with older buildings. The kind of street where the shadows seemed deeper, the darkness more oppressive. "Keep going," he said. The road wound through a part of town I didn't recognize, which was odd because I'd been driving this city for years. It wasn't the sort of place you'd just stumble upon. The buildings were run down, their windows dark and lifeless, and the streetlights were spaced too far apart, leaving long stretches of road cloaked in near total darkness. The further we went, the more I noticed how strange the air felt. It wasn't just quiet, it was still. The kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the world around you is holding its breath. Then I noticed something else. The clock on my dashboard had stopped. I blinked, glancing at it again to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The time read 11:47 p.m., the same time it had read the last time I'd looked. I tapped the glass over the display, but nothing changed. "Is your phone working?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond. I reached for my own phone, which was mounted on the dashboard, but as soon as I touched it, the screen went black. My stomach dropped. Okay, I told myself, maybe it's just a glitch. Phones crash all the time, right? But when I looked up, I realized the streetlights around us had started flickering. One by one, they blinked out, leaving us in near darkness. I slowed the car to a crawl, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and head back to the main road. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something about the way the man sat there, so still, so composed, made me feel like turning around wasn't an option. And then, just as I was about to say something, he leaned forward again. This time, he whispered, "Stop here." I hesitated, my hands tightening on the wheel. We were in the middle of an empty street, with no signs, no landmarks, nothing that indicated why he'd want to stop here. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said. I pulled the car over to the side of the road and put it in park. The engine hummed softly, the only sound in the oppressive silence. He didn't move right away. For a moment, I wondered if he was waiting for me to do something, but then he reached for the door handle. He opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges cutting through the quiet like a knife. As he stepped out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. His shadow. It didn't match his movements. When he stood up, his shadow stretched unnaturally long across the pavement, twisting and contorting in ways that didn't make sense. And when he walked away from the car, the shadow didn't follow him. It stayed there, lingering in the spot where he'd been sitting, as if it were still tethered to the seat. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could say anything, the man turned back to me. He leaned down, his face level with the open window. "You'll see," he said, his voice softer now, almost like a promise. And then he walked away. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My instincts told me to drive away, to get as far from this place as possible, but I couldn't seem to move. That's when I noticed the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was him, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, the street behind me was empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing off the buildings like they were coming from all around me. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. I whipped my head around, scanning the street, but there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows and silence. And then the passenger door opened. The sharp click of the passenger door opening snapped me out of my daze. I jerked my head to the right, fully expecting to see him, the man sitting back in the seat. But it was empty. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind tugged at it. My breathing hitched, and I could feel my heart pounding against my ribcage like it wanted to escape. I reached over and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. My fingers fumbled over the central locking system, ensuring all the doors were secure. "Nope, not doing this," I muttered to myself, trying to regain some sense of control. But then, the headlights flickered. I stared at the dashboard as the beams of light ahead of me dimmed and then surged back to life, casting eerie, wavering shadows on the cracked pavement. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't explain it, but the light felt wrong. It was as if it was trying to reveal something that shouldn't be seen. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps returned. This time, they weren't distant. They were right outside the car, circling. I spun around in my seat, my eyes darting from window to window. Each pane of glass reflected back the same scene: empty streets, still shadows. Yet the footsteps persisted, deliberate and unnervingly slow. They were heavy, like boots on gravel, even though the pavement was smooth. I shouted, "Who's there?" My voice sounded shaky, and I hated how small it felt in the oppressive quiet. No answer. The footsteps stopped again, this time at the driver's side door. My breath caught as I felt the faintest vibration in the car, like someone or something was leaning against it. I didn't dare look. My gaze stayed fixed ahead, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my palms ached. And then came the knock. A single, deliberate knock on the window, so soft it was almost polite. I turned my head slowly, my stomach churning with dread. There was no one there. No face pressed against the glass, no hand lingering on the frame. Just the empty street bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the flickering headlights. But when I looked closer, I saw it. A faint outline, barely perceptible, standing just beyond the reach of the light. It wasn't a person, not really. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape seemed to shift as I tried to focus on it. The edges of its form rippled, as if it were made of smoke or shadows. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. My instincts screamed at me to start the car, to get out of there, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Then it stepped closer. The movement was slow, deliberate, and unnaturally fluid. It didn't walk, it glided, its feet, or whatever it had in place of feet, never quite touching the ground. The closer it came, the more distorted the air around it became, like heat waves rising off asphalt on a summer day. I forced my hand to move, reaching for the ignition. My fingers trembled as I twisted the key, and the engine sputtered to life. Relief flooded through me for a brief moment, but it was short-lived. The figure was now standing directly in front of the car. Its form blocked the headlights completely, casting the interior of the car into darkness. I could make out more details now, the elongated limbs, the impossibly thin torso, and a face or something resembling a face that was utterly featureless. It raised one arm, its fingers or tendrils maybe stretching unnaturally long. It pointed directly at me. "Go," a voice whispered. It wasn't the man's voice. This one was different, hollow, distorted, as if it were coming from inside my head. I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed my foot down on the gas, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The figure didn't move. It stood there, unyielding, as I barreled toward it. But just as the car should have made contact, it vanished. The sudden absence of the figure was almost worse. The street ahead was empty, the headlights cutting through nothing but the eerie silence. My hands trembled on the wheel as I sped down the road, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. And then I saw it. The shadow was back, this time in the back seat. I swerved, nearly losing control of the car. "Get out," I screamed, twisting in my seat to face the back. But there was nothing there. The back seat was empty. I turned my attention back to the road just in time to see a sharp curve ahead. I yanked the wheel, the tires screeching as the car skidded dangerously close to the edge of the pavement. My heart pounded as I fought to regain control, the adrenaline coursing through me making my hands shake even more. When I finally straightened out, I dared another glance at the rearview mirror. The shadow was gone. But something else was there, a reflection. Not mine, and not the car's interior. The mirror showed a different place entirely, a dark, narrow hallway lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were damp and cracked, and at the far end of the hallway stood a door. The sight was so surreal that I almost forgot I was still driving. My eyes locked on the mirror, unable to look away from the door. It began to open. I snapped back to reality, yanking my eyes away from the rearview mirror. The road stretched out ahead, an endless expanse of asphalt swallowed by darkness. My mind was a chaotic mess, trying to reconcile what I had just seen with the fact that I was still behind the wheel. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The mirror, it was just a trick of my imagination, right? A hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. I forced myself to breathe, in and out, my chest rising and falling as I tried to steady my nerves. And then the car began to slow. Not me easing off the gas, the car was resisting, as if some invisible force was holding it back. The engine groaned in protest, the RPM needle dropping despite my foot being firmly pressed on the accelerator. "No, no, no," I muttered, panic rising in my chest. I slammed my foot harder on the pedal, but it was no use. The car crept to a stop in the middle of the empty road. The silence was deafening. I glanced at the dashboard, hoping for an answer. The engine light wasn't on. The gas tank was still half full. There was no logical reason for the car to stop. But logic had abandoned me miles ago. I reached for my phone, my trembling fingers fumbling to unlock it. Maybe I could call someone, anyone. But as I stared at the screen, my heart sank. The signal bar was empty. No service. That's when I heard it. The soft, rhythmic tapping. It started faint, like raindrops against a window, but quickly grew louder. It was coming from the roof of the car. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The tapping turned into scratching, long, deliberate strokes that sent shivers down my spine. Whatever was up there, it wasn't an animal. It was too methodical, too deliberate. I leaned forward, peering up at the windshield, half expecting to see something peering back. But the glass was clear, revealing only the vast, oppressive darkness of the night. Then, the scratching stopped. A low, guttural noise replaced it like a growl, but deeper, almost like the hum of a distant machine. It vibrated through the car, rattling the windows. My breath hitched, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Suddenly, the car shifted, as if something heavy had climbed onto the hood. The front end dipped slightly, the suspension groaning under the weight. My eyes darted to the windshield, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. And then I saw it. The figure from before, crouched on the hood. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body contorted in ways that defied anatomy. The featureless face was closer now, mere inches from the glass. Though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze boring into me, dissecting me, as if it were trying to understand what I was. The voice returned, inside my head this time. "Why are you running?" I screamed. It wasn't a conscious decision, just a raw, primal reaction to the overwhelming terror. I slammed my fist against the horn, the blaring noise filling the cabin and momentarily overpowering the voice. The figure didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head as if curious. Slowly, it raised one elongated arm, its fingers, or whatever they were, splaying out across the windshield. The glass groaned under the pressure, spiderweb cracks forming where its hand pressed. My instincts kicked in. I reached for the gear shift, yanking it into reverse. The engine roared to life, and the car jolted backward, throwing the figure off balance. It slid off the hood, disappearing from view. I didn't wait to see where it went. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, the tires screeching as they fought for traction. The car shot forward, and I gripped the wheel tightly, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of the figure. But the road ahead was empty. I drove for what felt like hours, my mind racing as I replayed the events over and over. The growling, the figure, the voice, it all felt like a nightmare, but the aching in my chest and the sweat-soaked seat beneath me were painfully real. Finally, I saw it at a gas station, its neon lights flickering like a beacon in the darkness. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the lot, the car sputtering to a stop near the pumps. I stumbled out, my legs shaky and unsteady. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it was grounding. I leaned against the car, trying to catch my breath, my eyes darting around the empty lot. The station was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across the cracked pavement. I made my way toward the building, the glass doors sliding open with a soft hiss. Inside, a lone cashier stood behind the counter, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone. He looked up as I approached, his expression shifting to mild concern. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice cutting through the fog in my mind. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. What could I even say? That I'd been chased by something that didn't exist? That my car had been stopped by some invisible force? Instead, I nodded weakly. "Just rough night." He nodded back, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before returning to his phone. I grabbed a bottle of water from the nearest shelf, my hands still trembling as I unscrewed the cap. The cool liquid did little to calm my nerves, but it gave me something to focus on. I stayed in the gas station for what felt like an eternity, too afraid to step back outside. When I finally worked up the courage, I found my car untouched, sitting exactly where I'd left it. The drive home was uneventful, the figure never reappearing. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was oppressive, a reminder of the unnatural quiet that had surrounded me earlier. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the house. It was the same house I'd lived in for years, but tonight it felt different. It felt wrong. I eventually forced myself out of the car and into the house, locking every door and window behind me. The walls of my home, usually a source of comfort, felt like they were closing in. Sleep didn't come that night, or the night after. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that road. I don't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But every time I drive at night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. And sometimes, when I glance in the rearview mirror, I see the faint outline of a shadow waiting patiently in the back seat. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened on that lonely stretch of road. But I've come to realize that some things, some experiences, aren't meant to be fully understood. They linger in the corners of our minds, like shadows we can't quite escape, like whispers we can't quite silence. And the more we try to make sense of them, the more they slip through our fingers. When I reflect on that night, I feel a creeping unease that hasn't faded. It's not just the image of the figure or the voice inside my head that haunts me. It's the deep, unshakable feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, that I wasn't meant to see what I saw, that there are things in this world, forces, presences, entities that exist outside of our understanding, outside the realms of what we consider possible or logical. I remember the voice, soft and cold, asking me, "Why are you running?" It wasn't a question that demanded an answer. It wasn't curious or inquisitive. It was accusatory, as if I had crossed some boundary that I wasn't supposed to cross. Maybe that's why I couldn't escape it, not just because of its overwhelming presence, but because I realized, deep down, that I had been running all my life. Running from the unknown, from the things I couldn't explain, from the parts of myself I refused to confront. And that night, the figure, whatever it was, had reminded me of that truth. The months since that night have been strange. There are moments when I feel the urge to forget, to push everything away as a product of stress, exhaustion, or a break from reality. I try to tell myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, a dream, a hallucination born from the exhaustion of too many late nights and too little sleep. I try to remind myself that the mind, when pushed to its limits, can create horrors more terrifying than any monster could ever be. But then there are the quiet moments, the times when I'm alone, sitting in the silence of my home or driving down a familiar road, and I feel it again. That sensation that I'm not truly alone, that there's something just beyond my reach, watching, waiting. I can't shake the image of the figure. Its twisted, contorted limbs, its face devoid of any discernible features, save for the ever-present sense of malice. I wonder, sometimes, if it's following me, if it's still there, waiting for me to drive down that same road again. I wonder if I'll ever encounter it again, or if it's already a part of me now lurking just beneath the surface. A shadow in my peripheral vision, a voice that whispers when the world falls silent. I've started to avoid certain roads, certain routes. I take the long way home. I've become hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking the rearview mirror, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. I know it sounds irrational, but I can't help it. There's a part of me that believes if I'm vigilant enough, if I never let my guard down, it won't find me again. But deep down, I know it's not that simple. I also know I'll never forget that night. The fear, the desperation, the sense of helplessness as I tried to outrun something that wasn't meant to be outrun. What if there was no escape? What if, no matter how fast I drove, no matter how far I went, I couldn't outrun what I had seen? What if it wasn't just a figure, a shadow, but something more, something that had been there all along, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? There's something else I've realized since that night. Something that has haunted me even more than the figure itself. It's the truth that has lingered in the back of my mind, creeping into my thoughts when I least expect it. What if I had been meant to see it? What if the encounter wasn't an accident? What if I had crossed paths with that entity for a reason? I can't explain why, but a part of me wonders if that figure was more than just a manifestation of fear or madness. Maybe it was trying to tell me something. Maybe it wasn't just some creature out of a nightmare. Maybe it was a part of something greater, a force that exists outside of human comprehension, one that taps into the darkest corners of the world. I've heard stories, legends, myths, and tales of strange encounters. People speak of creatures that exist between worlds, entities that don't belong to this reality. They are shadows, figments of the unknown, lurking just beyond the veil. I've always dismissed these stories, thinking of them as little more than superstition, folklore passed down through generations. But now, in the wake of my own experience, I can't help but wonder if those stories were based on something real. What if the world is full of these entities, these figures, just waiting for someone to stumble upon them? What if the road I was on wasn't just an empty stretch of asphalt, but a threshold, a crossing between worlds? And what if I had been chosen, or worse, cursed, to witness something I wasn't meant to see? Since that night, I've started researching. I've dug into ancient myths and obscure accounts of strange happenings. I've scoured the internet for anyone who has experienced something similar. And while I haven't found any answers, I've come across something unsettling. There are others out there who have had similar encounters. There are stories of shadowy figures, voices in the dark, strange occurrences that defy explanation. And many of these stories seem to share a common thread, a sense of being watched, a feeling of being hunted, a presence that doesn't belong. It's as if there's a hidden world around us, a world that exists right alongside our own, but just out of sight. A world where strange things happen, where creatures like the one I encountered exist, waiting for the moment when they reveal themselves. I've learned to live with the fear, or at least I've learned to suppress it. But there are nights when it comes back, when the memories resurface and the fear creeps in once more. And I find myself questioning everything, questioning whether I'll ever truly be safe again, questioning if there are things in this world that we aren't meant to understand. Maybe I'll never know the full truth. Maybe the figure on the road was just a manifestation of my own mind. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that it was real, that there are things in this world we can't explain, forces that exist beyond the limits of human understanding. And maybe, just maybe, we're not meant to understand them. Some things, I've come to realize, are better left unexplored. Some truths, some realities, are too dark, too unsettling to confront head-on. And maybe that's the most terrifying part of all. The road I was on that night stretches out ahead in my mind, a never-ending path that I can never fully leave behind. Each time I drive down the familiar streets, I wonder if I'll see it again, if the figure will return. And though I've tried to forget, tried to push it all away, I can't. It's as if that moment is now a part of me, etched into my memory, waiting in the dark corners of my mind for the right moment to resurface. Perhaps that's the greatest truth of all. Some roads, once traveled, can never be fully left behind. And some shadows, once seen, will always remain just out of reach. It was late autumn when I first set out on my road trip. The roads were long, empty stretches of asphalt leading through the countryside. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the air was turning colder with each mile I covered. I had a good 300 miles left before I could make it to the small town where I'd be spending the night. But as the hours stretched on, I began to realize I wasn't going to make it before it got dark. You know that feeling when you've been driving for what seems like hours and your body starts aching from sitting in the same position? That's where I was. My eyes were getting heavy, and I could feel the fatigue creeping up on me. I'd been on the road for longer than I planned, and now I was paying the price. The empty stretches of highway didn't help either, with nothing but trees and fields on either side. It was like the world had faded away, leaving me alone with the road. I knew I needed to stop somewhere soon before I fell asleep at the wheel. Then, as if on cue, I saw it in the distance, a dimly lit gas station on the side of the highway. It wasn't much, just a single pump, an old diner with flickering lights, and a few rusted cars in the parking lot. But it was enough to catch my attention. I decided it was time for a break. As I pulled into the lot, I noticed how eerily quiet everything was. The gas station felt abandoned, like something had happened there long ago, and now only the remnants remained. There was a certain stillness in the air, one that seemed to make the place feel frozen in time. It was strange, yet oddly comforting. I figured the owners probably closed up early, given how remote the area was. I parked my car and got out, stretching my legs to shake off the stiffness. The chill in the air nipped at my skin, making me zip up my jacket a little tighter. As I walked towards the diner, I couldn't help but notice how run down the place was. The paint was chipped and there were cracks in the windows. Still, the neon sign above the door buzzed faintly, illuminating the otherwise dark night. I stepped inside, the door creaking as it opened. The interior was dim, with only a few tables scattered around and a counter that had seen better days. A man stood behind the counter, wiping down a glass. He was tall and thin, with a pale face and dark, hollow eyes. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, and when he looked up at me, his gaze lingered a little too long. I could feel his eyes on me as I made my way to the counter. "Evening," I said, trying to break the silence. "Just need a quick rest." The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Not many come through here," he muttered, almost to himself. He seemed indifferent, but there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. I didn't want to think too much of it. The last thing I needed was to get paranoid over something so trivial. I took a seat at the counter, placing my hands on the cool surface. The place smelled like stale coffee and grease, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The walls were decorated with old photos, most of them yellowed with age. Some of them looked like they had been taken decades ago, and they featured people I didn't recognize. I couldn't help but wonder who they were. Was this place always this quiet, or had it been different once upon a time? I ordered a coffee, hoping it would wake me up a bit. The man behind the counter didn't ask any questions, just poured the coffee into a chipped mug and slid it over to me. He didn't seem interested in making conversation, which I didn't mind. I just wanted to rest for a bit before getting back on the road. As I sipped the hot liquid, I noticed the faint sound of something. Scratching. At first, I thought it was just the wind against the walls, but it didn't stop. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching noise, like something or someone was trying to get inside. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked around, trying to locate the source. The man behind the counter didn't seem to notice. His focus remained on the glass in front of him. I shook my head. It was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me after hours of driving. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more persistent. It felt wrong, like it was coming from somewhere close, somewhere hidden. I stood up and walked cautiously towards the back of the diner, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The man didn't even look up. As I approached the back door, the scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. My pulse quickened, and I felt my stomach tighten. There was something unsettling about the quiet. Something wasn't right. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I knew I wasn't alone. That's when I noticed it just beyond the back door, a dark shape lingering in the shadows, barely visible through the cracked window. The silence in the diner was deafening. It wasn't the kind of quiet that settles after a long, hard day. No, this was a tense, uncomfortable stillness that made my skin prickle with unease. I had only just turned to leave the back door when I saw a shape just beyond the window, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, almost like a person, but it was far too still to be anything human. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The scratching had stopped. Now, there was just the slow, steady hum of the neon sign outside and the distant sound of wind rustling the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That shape, whatever it was, lingered in the dark like it was waiting for me to make the next move. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes locked on that shadow. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Could it be another person? Maybe someone else who was stranded in this empty stretch of road, just like me? Or was it something else entirely? Something unnatural? I turned to look at the man behind the counter, hoping he might offer some kind of explanation, but he was still wiping down the same glass. He hadn't moved since I first entered. He was oddly unaffected by everything, the scratching, the strange shape outside, like he didn't notice anything was out of place. It was as though I was the only one in this place who sensed the discomfort. "Hey," I called out, my voice a little shaky. "Who's out there?" The man didn't respond. He just continued his slow, methodical movements, wiping the glass over and over again. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. That shape outside it wasn't just a trick of the light. I was sure of it. Something was wrong. Something was off. Without taking my eyes off the shadow, I slowly moved back towards the counter. I needed answers, or at the very least, some kind of reassurance. But when I reached the counter, the man was suddenly looking directly at me, his dark eyes locking with mine. It was the first time he'd acknowledged my presence since I walked in. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice low and distant. His words were strange, and the way he said them like he already knew what was coming sent a chill through me. I felt the air in the diner grow heavier, as if something unseen was pushing down on me. "What?" I asked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I'm just passing through." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out a dusty flashlight, shining it toward the back door. His expression remained blank, unreadable. "You should leave," he said, his tone even colder now. "Before it's too late." My mind raced as I glanced back at the window. The shadow was still there, but now it seemed closer, like it had moved just enough to make its presence known. I had no idea what the man was talking about. Leave? It was already dark outside, and I couldn't imagine driving another few hundred miles in my current state. I was tired, my eyes heavy, and the thought of continuing the journey felt like too much. "I don't know if I can just..." I started, but I was cut off by a loud bang from the back of the diner. It was so sudden, so jarring, that I jumped. My heart raced, and I spun around, staring at the door. The man didn't flinch. He simply stood up and walked toward the back door, his movements stiff, deliberate. Without a word, he reached for the door handle and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, and a gust of cold wind rushed in, followed by a smell of sour, decaying odor that made me gag. The air was thick with it, and I could feel it settle in my lungs. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Should I try to get out of there? But the shadow outside the shape that had been lurking just beyond the window was now unmistakable. I could see it more clearly, like a figure standing just inside the edge of the parking lot, watching me. Something wasn't right. The man didn't seem concerned, though. In fact, he didn't seem concerned about anything at all. He simply stood there, holding the door open, as if inviting whatever was out there to come inside. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I looked back at the man, waiting for some kind of explanation, some kind of action. But he didn't speak. He didn't move. His eyes were cold, empty. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice shaking. My mind was racing, and all I wanted was to get out of there. But the sense of dread that had settled over me made it impossible to act. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, leaving the door wide open. The air outside was so thick with tension that I could almost hear it crackling. Then, as if on cue, a low sound echoed from the darkness outside, a slow, dragging noise, like something being dragged across the gravel. I couldn't take it anymore. My feet moved before I even realized it, and I found myself running towards the door. I wasn't sure what I was doing, but I couldn't stay in there another second. But just as my hand reached the door, I froze. Something was wrong. The shape, the figure, I could see it more clearly now, and it wasn't alone. Another shape, darker, more hunched over, appeared behind it, slowly creeping forward, dragging something heavy along the ground. A chill ran down my spine, and I whipped around to face the man, but he was gone. He had vanished into the shadows of the diner, leaving me alone. No one was there. The place had gone completely silent again, the only sound the wind howling outside. Panic set in as I realized there was no way out. The figure outside was closing in, and I was trapped in this godforsaken diner with no way to escape. I ran to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as I tried to turn the knob. It was locked. I could hear the sound of something approaching from behind, that dragging noise getting louder, closer. I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. And that's when the man's voice, cold and emotionless, reached me from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come." The words echoed through the diner, and I felt the air grow colder. A cold that sunk deep into my bones. That was when I realized this wasn't just an abandoned gas station. It was something worse. Something far worse. And now I was part of it. The minutes felt like hours. My fingers were numb, the cold seeping into my skin as I pressed my hands against the door, desperately trying to pry it open. The sound of that dragging noise, the unmistakable scrape of something heavy being pulled along the ground, echoed in my mind, filling my ears with an unrelenting dread. The wind outside whipped through the cracks in the door, carrying with it the foul stench of decay, and every instinct in me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I was trapped. There was no escape. I stepped back from the door, my breath ragged in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears. The strange, emotionless man who had been standing by the counter was gone. The diner was eerily silent, the only sound the distant hum of the flickering neon sign outside. It was as though everything had come to a halt, as though the very air itself had frozen in place, holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes darting from corner to corner of the dimly lit diner. The place was a mess of chipped tiles and cracked windows, the remnants of an old, forgotten world. It looked like something out of a horror movie, a place that had been abandoned for years, yet somehow it was still standing. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the room, making every corner feel like a potential hiding spot for whatever was out there. Then, without warning, the lights went out. The entire diner was plunged into darkness. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. My breath hitched as I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound that might give me a clue about what was happening. For a moment, there was only the deafening silence. But then, I heard it soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The scraping noise had stopped. In its place was a soft, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking as I reached for anything to steady myself. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, but there was nothing but shadows and the faint outline of furniture. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, like the building itself had been suffocating for years, unable to breathe. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the words caught in my throat. My body was frozen, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was even capable of moving. The thudding grew louder, closer now, and I knew it was coming for me. I turned to the back of the diner, my eyes scanning the area, searching for an exit, anything that could give me a way out. But there was nothing. The back door was locked, the windows sealed shut with old, rusted metal bars. I was trapped, completely helpless. That's when I saw it. A faint glow appeared in the corner of my eye, a pale, sickly light that flickered like a dying candle. It was coming from the kitchen area, a small, cramped space behind the counter. I could barely make out the outline of the door, but the light, it wasn't natural. It was a strange, unsettling way, like something was glowing from the inside. The thudding had stopped, replaced by a soft, pulsing sound, like a heartbeat. Without thinking, I moved toward the kitchen, my steps cautious and slow. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but at this point, anything felt better than just standing there, waiting for whatever was out there to find me first. The air in the kitchen was thick, heavy with the smell of grease and something metallic. It stung my nose, making me gag as I stepped into the narrow room. There, in the corner, was the source of the light. It wasn't a lamp, as I first thought. No, it was something far worse. A small, circular object, glowing faintly in the dim room. As I approached it, I could see that it was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had touched it in years. The glow was coming from within the object, like it was radiating from the inside out. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the surface, and immediately The light flickered, growing brighter, pulsing with an unsettling rhythm. And then the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing as I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear something on the other side, something heavy and slow, dragging itself across the floor. It was getting closer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of trap? Had I unknowingly walked into something that had been waiting for years? Suddenly, I heard a voice soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere behind me, from the shadows in the far corner of the kitchen. "You should have left," the voice said, its tone cold and distant. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the faint glow of the object and the dark corners where the shadows seemed to stretch and twist. I was losing my mind. I had to get out of there. I had to leave before it was too late. I rushed to the door again, pushing with all my strength, but it wouldn't open. My panic grew, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow, my vision blurring as the walls seemed to close in around me. The pulsing light grew brighter, and I could feel it pressing against my skin, as if it were trying to pull me in. And then, the thudding began again. It wasn't from the other side of the door this time. It was coming from within the room. From the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was everywhere. It was like the building itself was alive, moving, breathing, and it was coming for me. I turned, my mind a whirlwind of fear, but I couldn't focus. My body was shaking uncontrollably, my heart racing as I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor. I looked down, and that's when I saw it, the reflection in the small puddle of water on the floor. It wasn't just my face staring back at me. No, there were other shadowy figures, their eyes hollow and lifeless, staring back at me from the depths of the water. They were reaching for me, their hands twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, as if they were trying to pull me into the puddle itself. I screamed, scrambling to my feet, but the figures only grew more numerous, more persistent. Their hands were everywhere, pulling, grasping, and I felt something cold, something sharp, scrape against my skin as they drew closer. With every ounce of strength I had left, I tore myself away from the grip of the shadows, my feet pounding against the floor as I ran toward the door. The pulsing light flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I reached the front of the diner, where the door was still locked. But now there was no dragging sound, no thudding, no more whispers. I was alone. The building was silent. I had no idea how I had made it out, or if I was truly out of danger. But I knew one thing for certain: whatever was in that diner, whatever was pulling me in, was still out there. And it wouldn't stop until it had me. I could feel it now, the intense, suffocating pressure of the unknown closing in around me. My chest was tight, each breath shallow and desperate. My heart pounded in my ears as I gripped the door handle with trembling hands. The cold metal bit into my palm, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The world beyond that door had become a place of nightmares, a place where reason no longer existed. And whatever it was that had been stalking me, the things in the shadows had followed me out of the kitchen, out of the suffocating walls of the diner. The room behind me was empty, save for the remnants of the glowing object and the distant hum of the flickering lights. The same foul stench of decay lingered in the air, but now it seemed more intense, like it had filled every corner of the diner. I could smell it in my clothes and my hair, as if it had seeped into me, marking me with its presence. The silence felt oppressive, pressing against me from every direction. I turned back toward the kitchen, hoping that somehow I could make sense of it all. The odd glow from the corner had faded, leaving nothing but darkness behind. It was as though the kitchen itself had never been there, as if it had evaporated into thin air, leaving only the broken remains of a forgotten world. My mind reeled, trying to comprehend what was happening, what I had seen, but the answers didn't come. And then I heard it. A sound so loud, so deafening, that it stopped me in my tracks. It was like the air itself had been ripped apart, a sharp, unnatural crackling sound, like static from a broken radio. My head snapped to the side as the lights overhead flickered again, more violently this time. The room seemed to shift, to warp, as if reality itself were bending, breaking under the pressure of whatever had taken hold of this place. I stumbled back, my heart racing as my eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement, any sign of danger. But the room remained still, too still. The silence was unbearable. And then it happened. The door I had been so desperately trying to open, the one that had been locked before, suddenly burst open with a force that sent me flying backward. The air around me turned cold, bitterly cold, and I gasped as the temperature plummeted, the chills sinking deep into my bones. Through the doorway, I saw them. Shadows, figures, their shapes indistinct, as though they were made of smoke or fog. They moved toward me, slowly, purposefully, their movements unnatural, as if they were gliding rather than walking. Their forms flickered, distorted, like half-formed reflections in a broken mirror. But their eyes, those eyes, were the worst part. Hollow and dark, like voids that swallowed everything in their path. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadows came closer, filling the doorway, their presence overwhelming. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to watch, to bear witness to whatever horror was about to unfold. And then, one of the figures stepped forward, its form taking shape as it emerged from the darkness. It wasn't human. At least, not in the way I understood it. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its body elongated and twisted in ways that defied all logic. Its skin, if you could even call it that, was smooth and gray, like stone that had been worn down by years of wind and rain. Its limbs were thin and disproportionate, each one stretching far beyond what was natural. But what struck me most was its face, or what should have been a face. It was featureless, smooth, like a blank canvas. No eyes, no mouth, nothing but a dull, gray surface where a face should have been. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like I was hypnotized, drawn to it by some unseen force. The air in the room thickened, becoming dense, oppressive. I could barely breathe as the figure reached out, its long, thin fingers stretching toward me. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me to suffocate in the presence of this thing. But before it could touch me, a voice, low, guttural, like something being dragged from the depths of the earth, rang out from somewhere behind the figure. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice rasped. "Now, you belong to us." I whipped around, my eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing but darkness. I could feel the presence of the shadows, their weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. They were everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. The figure in front of me tilted its head, its body shifting in the darkness, as if it were studying me. It was then that I noticed something, the faint glow in its chest. A soft, pulsating light that seemed to come from within. It was the same glow I had seen in the kitchen, the same strange, sickly light that had filled the room with an unsettling energy. "What are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it reached up, its long, spindly fingers brushing the smooth surface of its face, as if it were feeling for something. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it pressed its fingers into the skin, and to my horror, the skin gave way. It peeled back, like paper being torn from a book, revealing something beneath. A face! Not a human face, but something far worse. It was twisted and grotesque, like a mockery of a human form. The features were jagged, as if they had been carved out of stone, and the eyes, those eyes, were the darkest pits I had ever seen. There was no life in them, no warmth, just endless, unfeeling darkness. I recoiled in horror, stumbling backward, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "It's too late," the voice from behind the figure said again. "You're already part of this place now. You can't leave." I turned to run, my legs finally working as I bolted for the door, but the shadows closed in around me, blocking my way. They reached for me with their long, inhuman arms, pulling me back, dragging me toward the figure that still stood in the doorway. "No," I screamed, fighting with every ounce of strength I had left, but it was no use. The shadows were too strong, their grip too tight. They pulled me back into the center of the room, where the figure waited, its face still hidden beneath the layers of its unnatural skin. I was trapped. There was no escape. And then, everything went black. When I came to, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. The world around me felt disjointed, like I was floating between reality and something else, something darker. My body ached, and my mind struggled to process the overwhelming fear that had consumed me just moments before. It felt like I had been pulled from one nightmare into another, but this time, the atmosphere was different. The oppressive air had lifted, and the coldness that had gripped me was gone. But that didn't bring any comfort. I opened my eyes, blinking against the dim light. The diner was still there, but it wasn't the same. The walls, once familiar, now felt foreign, warped by the events that had unfolded. The strange presence, the shadows, the creatures, they were all gone, but their mark had been left behind. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach. The place had been tainted, altered by whatever had happened. I tried to sit up, but my body refused to cooperate. My arms and legs were heavy, like I was carrying the weight of something far too large. I pushed myself to my feet, staggering slightly as I steadied myself against the counter. My head was spinning, and I had to focus on staying upright. Then I remembered. The figure, the face, the voices, the shadows. Everything came rushing back in a flood of terror, and I felt the panic rise in my chest again. I had to get out of there. I stumbled toward the door, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence of the diner. But when I reached for the door handle, I stopped. There, on the ground in front of me, was something I hadn't seen before. A small, weathered key. It was resting on the floor, as if it had been placed there deliberately. I hesitated. My mind raced. What did it mean? Why was it here? Could it be the key to leaving? To escaping this nightmare? My hand hovered over it, the cold metal of the key seeming to pulse with an energy of its own. But as I reached down to pick it up, a voice, soft but distinct, whispered in my ear. "Don't!" I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the empty diner, the shadows of the room cast long across the floor by the fading light from the window. I didn't know what was worse. The fact that the voice had spoken directly into my ear, or the fact that it had sounded familiar. I turned back to the key. The voice was gone, but the sense of dread it left behind was enough to make my hand tremble. But I couldn't stay here forever. Whatever had happened, whatever I had seen, it wasn't something I could just forget. I had to know what had happened. I had to get out. I grabbed the key. The moment I touched it, the world around me seemed to shift. The air grew thick again, the oppressive weight returning like an old friend. The walls of the diner seemed to close in, the windows growing darker, the lights overhead flickering once more. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. Whatever I had just done, it was connected to the darkness, to whatever had haunted this place. I stumbled back, clutching the key tightly in my hand, as if it were the only thing that could save me. The room seemed to close in around me, warping, shifting, the shadows reaching out once again. I ran for the door, but this time, when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't turn. The key I held in my hand seemed to hum, vibrating with an unnatural energy, as if it was calling me. I placed the key into the lock, and the door creaked open. Beyond it, the world outside was unchanged. The night was still thick and silent, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain. But as I stepped out of the diner and into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, like I had been here before, like I had walked this same path 1,000 times. The shadows of the diner's structure stretched long and ominous behind me, and I could hear the distant sound of someone moving inside. But I was free. I stumbled away from the diner, away from the thing that had held me captive, and into the darkened night. My legs were weak, my mind still reeling from the horrors I had seen, but I kept moving. The key I still held felt cold, the metal pressing into my palm like a reminder of everything that had happened. I didn't know what it all meant, and I didn't know what was real anymore. The line between the world I knew and the nightmare I had just survived had blurred beyond recognition. The road stretched out before me, empty and silent, as I walked away from the diner, from the strange place that had been home to whatever dark force had pulled me in. My mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to, questions that I wasn't sure I ever would. And then, just as I thought I was alone, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, haunting. It was familiar. The same voice I had heard before. You can never leave. I turned, my heart racing, but the road behind me was empty. The diner was a faint silhouette in the distance, its windows glowing faintly in the night, like eyes watching me. I couldn't escape that feeling, the feeling that something or someone was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception. But I didn't look back. I kept walking, my footsteps heavy on the gravel, my heart pounding in my chest. And no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, I had never really left at all. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching out into the vast, dark expanse. I could feel the cool night air against my skin, the weight of everything I had experienced still pressing on my mind. It was as if the horrors of that night were never far behind, just waiting in the shadows, ready to pull me back into that dreadful place. The voices, the creatures, the overwhelming sense of fear that had nearly consumed me. It all felt so real, and yet, with every step I took away from that diner, it seemed more and more like a distant memory. A nightmare that was starting to fade, but still clinging to me in the most unsettling of ways. I tried to push the thoughts aside. I had made it out. I had escaped. The worst was over. But as the cold wind cut through me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't quite done with me. The road was empty. The distant hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound, yet it felt too quiet, too still. No animals stirred in the brush. No distant voices called out from the woods. Just silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't see or understand. I kept walking, my mind replaying the strange, haunting events that had unfolded back at the gas station. What had it all meant? Was it the work of something supernatural, or had I simply been driven to madness by the isolation, the fear, the darkness? Was I still dreaming? I wasn't sure anymore. As I walked, I glanced at the key still clutched tightly in my hand. It seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if calling to me. But I refused to listen. The diner, that place of terror, was behind me now. I had broken free. The key should have meant nothing more than a strange trinket from a forgotten nightmare. Yet, something told me that it wasn't done with me. That somehow, someway, the key was the one thing that connected me to that dark, twisted world. A chill ran down my spine. I stopped walking and looked up at the sky. The stars were barely visible through the thick veil of clouds, but there was something about the sky tonight, something that felt different. The clouds were moving, shifting in a way that didn't seem natural, like they were being drawn towards something. A storm was coming, but not one that could be explained by weather patterns. It was as if the entire world was preparing for something I didn't want to understand. I pulled the key out of my pocket and looked at it again. My fingers brushed over the cold metal, and I felt it again, the pull, the desire to return, to find out more. It was maddening. The temptation was too strong, and even though every part of me screamed to throw the key away, to forget about it, I couldn't. The key had a grip on me, like a string pulling me back to something dark and dangerous. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine broke through the silence. I turned, and in the distance, I saw the headlights of a vehicle coming toward me. The light was bright, blinding, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But the sound grew louder, and soon, the car came into view, a lone vehicle speeding down the empty road, moving faster than it should have been. My heart skipped a beat. The car slowed as it approached, and I stepped off the road to the side, unsure of what to do. As it came closer, I saw the figure in the driver's seat, a man, his face obscured by shadow. He didn't seem to notice me at first. The car came to a complete stop, the engine humming softly in the quiet night. The door opened with a creak, and the man stepped out. He was tall, his features hidden in the dim light, but there was something unsettling about him. Something off. The way he moved, the way he stared at me as if he knew me, as if he had been waiting for me. I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to do. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. He walked slowly toward me, his eyes fixed on mine. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. I didn't answer at first. I couldn't. My throat felt dry, my heart racing in my chest. I wanted to tell him everything, to scream, to beg him to help me, to make the nightmares go away. But the words wouldn't come. The man stepped closer, and with each step, I felt that pull, the same pull that had gripped me when I held the key. It was as if he was part of the nightmare, a part of the world I had tried to escape. "Do you know what it is you found?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and shiny. He held it up for me to see. It was a key. The same key. My heart stopped. My blood ran cold. "You can't escape it," he said softly. "It always finds its way back." Before I could react, he turned and walked back to his car, getting in without another word. The car's engine roared to life, and as the headlights flared bright once more, I watched in stunned silence as the car sped off into the night. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. Had it been real? Was it just another part of the nightmare? I didn't know. But as the last echo of the car faded into the distance, I felt the weight of the key in my hand once again. The world around me seemed to grow still, the air thick with tension, as if something was about to happen, something I couldn't escape. I looked down at the key one final time, and in that moment, I realized the truth. It wasn't just the diner that was connected to the darkness. It was me. I had always been part of it, always would be. The key wasn't just a way in. It was a way to hold on. The nightmare would never truly end, and neither would I. It was a chilly evening in late October when I moved into the old apartment on Maple Street. To say the place had character would be an understatement. It had a history, one that seemed to whisper its secrets through the creaking floorboards and the thin walls. It had been a long day of moving boxes and setting up furniture, but I was excited. After months of searching for a new place, I finally found something that felt like home, even if it was a little rough around the edges. I wasn't new to city life, having spent the past few years living in various rented spaces, but this one felt different. The building had an air of age, as if the walls had seen things, heard things. The landlord, a quiet man named Mr. Henderson, had warned me about the building's history. He mentioned a few tenants had left unexpectedly over the years. Nothing too alarming, he'd said. Just people moving on, that's all. The apartment had been vacant for a while before I came along, and I was eager to settle in and make it my own. The first night was peaceful, or so I thought. I unpacked my things, arranged the furniture just how I liked it, and then collapsed into bed, exhausted from the day's work. The apartment was cozy, though the furniture was old, and the floors had a creak to them that you couldn't ignore. But I liked it. It was quiet, private, and best of all, affordable, something I hadn't had in a long time. The sound of the city was distant, muffled by the thick walls of the building, and the dim light from the streetlights outside filtered through the blinds in a calming way. I had a view of the alley behind the building, but it didn't bother me. It was just another part of the city, and I felt safe enough. But as I lay in bed that night, the stillness of the apartment seemed almost too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was subtle, like a whisper on the edge of your hearing, but it was there. The air in the room felt heavy, as though it was pregnant with something unseen. I brushed it off as nothing more than the exhaustion from the move and the unfamiliarity of the new place. It wasn't until the second night that things began to change. That's when I first heard the noises. I had been in and out of sleep, drifting in that half-conscious state when I heard it, a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes groaning or the wind tapping at the window. But then it came again, louder this time. A rhythmic tap, tap, tap that seemed to come from the walls themselves. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't let myself panic. It was probably just an old building settling, I reasoned. But the tapping continued, and it seemed to grow louder, closer, until it was right above me. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers tighter around me, but the sound wouldn't stop. It was as though whatever was making the noise was pacing, moving back and forth just above my head. The tapping didn't have a natural rhythm, though. It was erratic, almost deliberate. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. The room felt colder suddenly, and I could see my breath in the air. I got up and walked over to the window, but everything looked fine outside. The alley was empty, the streetlights flickering softly in the distance. I looked around the room, scanning for anything out of the ordinary, but everything was as it should be. My heart was racing now, but I told myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The third night brought more of the same. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't just above me, it was coming from the walls, from all directions. The sound echoed through the apartment, growing louder and more frantic, like 1,000 invisible fingers drumming against the walls. I lay there, frozen in place, unable to move. The air was thick, suffocating, and the temperature in the room had dropped again. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was rats in the walls, I thought. Old buildings sometimes had issues with pests. But as the tapping continued, my rational mind began to slip away. This wasn't just an old building settling. This wasn't normal. I got up and checked every inch of the apartment. The taps were still there, echoing, almost mocking me. I walked over to the kitchen and found nothing. The bathroom was the same. Everything was in its place, but the atmosphere was changing. It felt as if the walls were closing in, pressing down on me. I felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat in the corner of my living room, watching the shadows shift on the walls as the tapping grew louder. It was relentless. I wasn't sure how long it lasted, but when the sun began to rise, the noise stopped. I could finally breathe again, but it was only a temporary relief. The days that followed were filled with strange occurrences. Doors would creak open by themselves. Lights would flicker even when the bulbs were new. The air never felt quite right, always thick with an unspoken presence. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was there, something that didn't want me in this apartment. Still, I stayed. I told myself that I was being silly. This was just a normal part of living in an old building, right? But deep down, I knew better. Something was happening, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore it. The last straw came a week later when I found a small, handwritten note under my door. It simply read, "You're not alone." I didn't know what that meant, but I felt my blood run cold. I had to find out what was going on, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I was about to uncover. The days after receiving the note were strange, to say the least. I found myself constantly on edge, my eyes darting toward the walls and ceilings, half expecting something or someone on the other side. Each night, the tapping came, but it wasn't consistent. Some nights, it was almost imperceptible, a faint echo in the distance. Other times, it pounded relentlessly, as if it was trying to force its way into my thoughts. But it wasn't just the tapping that unsettled me now. It was everything else. The apartment felt colder, the air thicker. It was almost as if the apartment itself was aware of my presence, and it was quietly waiting for me to acknowledge it. There were moments when I thought I could feel something brushing past me, an invisible presence that would slip just beyond my line of sight. I turned, expecting to see someone there, but there was never anyone. It started innocently enough. I was sitting at the kitchen table one afternoon, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed the light above me flicker. I looked up, irritated, and swiped at the switch to try to get it to stop, but it continued to blink on and off, casting eerie shadows around the room. The sound of the light buzzing seemed amplified in the silence, as if it was mocking me. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a faulty bulb. But as I reached for the lamp to unscrew the light bulb and replace it, something caught my attention. A chill swept through the room, sharp and biting, despite the fact that the heat was on. The temperature drop was sudden, like stepping into a freezer, and it made my skin prickle. I paused for a moment, feeling the hair on the back of my neck rise. Was it just the old building, or was there something more to it? I turned the light off, but it didn't help. The chill lingered. The air felt unnatural, thick with an invisible weight, as if something unseen was hovering just above me. I quickly replaced the bulb, convinced that the flickering was simply a sign of wear and tear. But as soon as I finished, I heard a soft, rustling sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing through the trees outside, but the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone or something was moving behind the walls. I froze, listening. There it was again, soft, deliberate rustling. The sound seemed to come from just above my head, almost as if the walls were alive. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see a shadow dart across the floor, but there was nothing. The room was still. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. It continued. I finally stood up, heart racing, and walked to the hallway. My mind was racing now, trying to piece together some rational explanation. Maybe it was just the house settling, or maybe it was the neighbors upstairs. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to believe it could be anything else. But as I stood in the hallway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the closet in the hallway, the one that had been shut tightly just moments before, was now slightly ajar. Just a crack, barely enough for me to notice. But it was enough. I stepped toward it, hesitating for a moment before gently pushing the door open. Inside, the closet was empty, save for a few boxes and an old coat rack. But there, lying on the floor, was a single object that hadn't been there before. A small, black feather. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It was soft, almost too soft, like it had been placed there deliberately. The feather was unlike any I had ever seen before. It was unnaturally smooth, the kind of texture that made your skin crawl when you touched it. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if it could be from a bird, but there was no bird in sight. The feather felt out of place, like it didn't belong. I stood there for a long while, turning the feather over in my hand, trying to rationalize its presence. But no explanation came to mind. It didn't make sense. And just when I thought I had convinced myself it was just some odd coincidence, I heard it again, the tapping. It started quietly at first, like the sound of nails scraping against wood, and then it grew louder. It was unmistakable, now clear and deliberate, echoing through the apartment. The tapping seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the walls, the floors, the ceiling. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was as if the sound was surrounding me. I felt my heart race as the noise grew louder. It wasn't like the usual tapping I had heard before. This time, it was frantic, almost desperate, as if something was trying to get my attention. I could feel the vibrations under my feet, the walls shaking slightly, like the building itself was alive. I stood frozen in place, the feather still clutched tightly in my hand. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My body was paralyzed by fear. I had to get out of there, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the walls, as if whatever was inside the apartment was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. Then, as quickly as it started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as though the apartment had exhaled a breath, and now everything was still. The coldness that had seeped into the room lingered, but the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking as I slowly backed away from the closet, still clutching the feather. I didn't know what I was dealing with. The rational part of my brain told me it was just the quirks of an old building, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The apartment wasn't just old, it was haunted. I ran back to the living room, slamming the door behind me. My mind was racing. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but every nerve in my body was telling me otherwise. The tapping, the feather, the strange coldness, it all pointed to something far worse than I was willing to admit. As I sat on the couch, trying to steady my breathing, I heard the faintest sound, just a whisper, barely audible over the noise in my head. "You're not alone." I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was losing my mind. But that was the moment I realized I was no longer in control. Whatever was in this apartment wasn't going to let me go so easily. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling sense of dread, a constant reminder that something was very wrong. Every creak of the floorboards, every sudden draft, every sound I couldn't place seemed amplified, as if the apartment had become more sensitive to my presence, responding to every breath I took. I was becoming increasingly aware of the walls, the floors, the very air around me. Every element of the apartment now seemed alive, as if it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. It was as if the strange events had multiplied overnight. The flickering light above me now happened multiple times a day, never consistent, but always just enough to make my heart skip a beat. The taps had become louder, clearer, and, worst of all, more frequent. They came in the dead of night, when the house was still and the silence was thick, pressing against my ears. The tapping would start softly, almost imperceptibly, and then grow in volume, echoing in a rhythmic pattern that sent chills down my spine. It was as though the sound was circling around me, coming from every corner, every wall, every surface. I couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. One morning, I woke up to find the entire apartment colder than usual. I could see my breath in the air as I sat up in bed, and a shiver ran through me, not from the temperature, but from the growing sense of something otherworldly taking hold. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself and stood up, trying to shake off the unease. But as I walked across the room, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The window was open. I hadn't opened it. In fact, I was sure I had closed it the night before going to sleep. But now, there it was wide open, the curtains billowing slightly in the breeze, the air outside frigid. I walked over to shut it, but as my fingers gripped the edge of the window frame, I froze. A sharp metallic scent filled the air heavy, almost sickly. It was familiar, but I couldn't place it. I stepped back, my mind racing as I tried to understand what was happening. The wind was picking up, rattling the window pane, but something about it felt wrong, as if it were trying to communicate with me, urging me to listen, to pay attention. I didn't want to. I wanted to go back to sleep, pretend that everything was normal, that this was just some weird coincidence. But the cold, biting air refused to let me ignore it. It made my skin crawl, sending a shiver down my spine as I backed away from the window. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent than ever before. It seemed to come from behind the walls again, the sound reverberating like a constant drumbeat. It was no longer subtle, it was urgent, desperate, almost demanding. I could hear it in every room, in the hallways, in the corners of my apartment, creeping into my thoughts and making them swirl in a dizzying spiral. I tried to ignore it, to shut it out, but it was impossible. I had to know what was happening. I had to find the source. The next day, I decided to investigate. I couldn't keep pretending that this was all in my head. Something was going on in this apartment, and I wasn't going to rest until I found out what. I started with the walls. I pressed my ears against them, trying to detect any sign of movement. any subtle noise that would lead me to the source of the tapping. The walls were cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so, but I couldn't feel any vibrations. It was as though whatever was causing the noise was hidden beneath the surface, far out of reach. I traced my fingers along the edges of the drywall, searching for anything that might stand out, but there was nothing. Next, I moved to the floor. I dropped to my knees and ran my hand over the wooden planks, trying to feel for any shifts, any cracks that might reveal the truth. The floorboards groaned under my touch, but everything seemed normal to normal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deliberately keeping me from finding it. As I sat back, frustration bubbling inside me, I heard it again. The tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the floor. I froze, heart hammering in my chest as I listened. The sound was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. My eyes widened, my mind racing as I stood up and moved quickly to the center of the room. I bent down, hands shaking as I pushed at the edge of the carpet. I had to see. The sound was louder now, more distinct. It was a steady, rhythmic tapping, like something or someone was knocking from beneath the floor. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but as I lifted the corner of the carpet, a chill washed over me. There, embedded in the wood, was a small, old-fashioned key. It was ornate, with intricate designs carved into the metal. I picked it up carefully, feeling its weight in my palm. It didn't belong. I could tell it was ancient, far older than the apartment itself. I felt a shudder run through me as I turned the key over in my hand. There was something about it, something that felt wrong. I looked around, as if the apartment itself was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. I didn't know what this key was for, or why it had been hidden beneath the floorboards, but the tapping had stopped. The air had grown still. I decided to explore further, to find out where this key led. I began opening every drawer, every cabinet, searching for anything that could explain the strange events. As I searched, I couldn't help but feel the air growing heavier, pressing down on me with an invisible force. The apartment seemed to close in, as if it were trapping me inside. Then I found it. A small, locked door at the far end of the hallway, a door I had never noticed before. It was hidden behind a large, decorative painting, so well disguised that I hadn't even thought to check it. The key fit perfectly into the lock. With a deep breath, I turned it, the heavy click of the lock echoing through the silence. I opened the door slowly, half expecting to see something terrible on the other side. What I found was nothing. A dark, empty room. I stepped inside, feeling the cold air hit me like a wave. The room was small and bare, with nothing but dust and cobwebs. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt. But there, in the center of the room, was a single object. A mirror. I approached it cautiously, my reflection distorted in the cracked surface. The mirror was old, covered in layers of grime and dust, but there was something about it that seemed out of place. It was as if it didn't belong, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I reached out, my hand trembling as I brushed the dust away from the surface. That's when I saw it. A shadow! It flickered just behind my reflection, moving unnaturally fast. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one. The tapping started again, louder now, coming from all around me. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in as the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding. The shadow in the mirror shifted again, growing larger, until it was no longer just a shadow. It was a figure that was now standing right behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. I was alone. But the tapping, it was getting louder, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I wasn't alone anymore, and I wasn't sure I ever would be again. The oppressive silence that followed the tapping was unbearable. It hung in the air like a heavy cloud, suffocating me, making it impossible to breathe. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to tear my eyes away from the mirror. The shadow had been there, I was sure of it, but when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the empty room, suffocating in its isolation. I felt the temperature drop, the air growing thick with something I couldn't quite place. The light in the hallway flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cracked walls. I wanted to leave, to run as fast as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the apartment had taken hold of me, like it was holding me in place, forcing me to witness whatever was about to happen. Then the tapping returned. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It wasn't coming from the floor. No, it was coming from the mirror itself. A loud bang echoed in the room, sharp and sudden, like a fist pounding against glass. I jumped, my heart skipping a beat as I stumbled backward. The mirror. It was vibrating. The surface rippled, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone moving on the other side. I reached out without thinking, my fingers grazing the cold surface of the glass. The moment my skin made contact, a shock of electricity shot through me, making my entire body convulse. The mirror seemed to pulse with energy, as if it had a life of its own. The tapping intensified, becoming frantic, and I felt it deep within my bones. Then, the figure appeared. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a full-bodied shape, a man or something that resembled a man. His face was distorted, like it had been pressed against the other side of the glass, a grotesque, twisted version of a human being. His eyes were wide open, hollow, dark, and lifeless. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, one that seemed too wide, too unnatural. I staggered backward, a scream caught in my throat. My chest tightened as a wave of pure terror washed over me, drowning me. The figure in the mirror moved, its hand pressing against the glass, as if trying to break through. My pulse quickened, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get away, but my feet were rooted to the floor. The figure's mouth opened, and I heard a sound of voice, but it wasn't coming from the figure's lips. No, it was coming from all around me. It was everywhere. The voice, a low growl, reverberated in my skull. "Get out!" The words were a command, an order that I couldn't ignore. But my body wouldn't obey. The fear was so thick, so overpowering, that I couldn't even think straight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing made sense. How could this be real? This couldn't be happening. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was like a drum beat, pounding in time with my frantic heartbeat. I could feel it in the floor beneath my feet, in the walls, in the very air around me. The room seemed to close in, the walls bending inward as if they were going to collapse on me. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was struggling against some unseen force. It reached out, its hand stretching through the glass, the fingers twisting, elongating unnaturally. The glass began to crack under the pressure, and I could see the figure's hand pushing through the fractures. I stumbled backward, falling to the floor in panic, my hands desperately clawing at the carpet as if it would offer some kind of escape. But the figure wasn't finished. No, it was coming for me. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash, the force of it sending a shock through my body. I whipped around, eyes wide, but I couldn't see anything through the cracks in the door. There was nothing, just the oppressive, heavy silence that now filled the room. And then, the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 glass shards falling to the floor at once. The figure inside it seemed to break apart, its twisted form disintegrating, melting into the shards of glass as they rained down to the ground. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I was safe. But then, I heard something. A low, guttural laugh. It echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls, bouncing around in my head. I felt it in my chest, deep in my bones, as if the very essence of it was trying to claim me. I turned and saw it. The figure wasn't gone. No, it was standing behind me, right there in the room with me. Its distorted, grinning face was inches from mine, its cold breath on my skin, its eyes staring into my soul. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against my cheek, cold as ice. Its touch was suffocating, and I felt my body go numb, the fear consuming me from the inside out. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs refused to move. And then, as if on cue, the room went completely dark. I was plunged into an abyss, unable to see anything. The darkness was so thick, it pressed against my skin, making it hard to breathe. The figure's presence was all around me, closing in, suffocating me with its malice. I could hear its breathing now, slow and deliberate, coming from all sides. It was so close. Too close. I could feel its eyes on me, could sense its twisted grin stretching wider with every passing second. It whispered, its voice a low, raspy hiss that made my blood run cold. You shouldn't have stayed. The last thing I remember is the overwhelming sense of dread. I woke up in the same place I had collapsed, but everything had changed. The air no longer felt thick with fear, it was cold, unnaturally cold. I was lying on the floor, my body aching from the tense, paralyzed state I had been in. My skin tingled, and my pulse raced in my ears as I tried to sit up. My eyes scanned the room, but everything was normal. The shattered mirror lay in pieces, scattered across the floor like a broken puzzle, reflecting the dim light from the hallway beyond the door. But there were no shadows, no figures, no eerie whispers. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, a silence that seemed almost too quiet, too calm after what had just happened. My heart still pounded in my chest as I forced myself to stand. The apartment felt hollow, like it had been emptied of all life. The oppressive atmosphere that had been so thick before seemed to have dissipated, but the fear lingered like an invisible fog, clouding my every thought. Was it over? Had I escaped whatever had haunted me, or was this just the calm before the storm? I glanced toward the front door, my only means of escape. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling, but I hesitated. What if something was waiting for me out there? What if it was only the beginning, and the worst was yet to come? But I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. I had to leave. There was no other choice. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and stepped out into the hallway. The door slammed behind me with a final, decisive click, almost as if the apartment itself was locking me out. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The hallway seemed much longer now, as though it stretched farther than I remembered, its flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The same hallway I had walked down countless times, but now it felt like a labyrinth, twisting and changing around me. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing through the narrow space, the sound amplifying in the quiet. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the button, but the elevator didn't arrive. I waited, tapping my foot impatiently, but the doors remained closed. Another minute passed, then another. It was then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise. The faintest scrape of something against the floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was I imagining things? Was it just the lingering effects of the fear I had felt earlier? My mind playing tricks on me after the horror I had witnessed? But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder, closer. I turned, my heart racing once more. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, but there was nothing. Only the dim light flickering overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. The air felt heavier again, like it had before, but this time I was prepared. Whatever had happened in that apartment, whatever had been following me, it hadn't been finished. I stepped back, backing away from the elevator, the scrape growing louder, like something or someone was dragging itself across the floor. I could feel my pulse quickening, my body tensing with every step I took, ready to run. The elevator doors finally slid open with a jolt. I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed with a soft chime, and I exhaled, leaning against the wall as the elevator descended. But even as the elevator moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes flickered nervously over my shoulder, scanning the empty space behind me. There was nothing there, but the sensation was overwhelming. It was as if something or someone was lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The elevator came to a halt with a soft ding, and the doors slid open to reveal the empty lobby. I stepped out, breathing a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. The lobby was still, too still. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I made my way toward the front doors, but as I reached for the handle, I stopped. There, on the floor near the entrance, was something I hadn't noticed before. A shard of glass, the same glass from the broken mirror. I knelt down slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the shard. It was cold, cold enough to make my fingers ache. I held it for a moment, staring at its jagged edges, before something caught my eye. There, etched into the glass, was a name. Evelyn. The name sent a chill through me, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I didn't know anyone by that name, yet something about it felt familiar. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like a connection, like this was something I should know. But before I could contemplate it any further, the lobby door swung open. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat. A woman stepped inside, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked almost familiar, but I couldn't place her. She seemed frantic, her eyes darting around the lobby as if searching for something or someone. She didn't notice me at first, too caught up in her own panic, but when she did, she stopped. Her gaze met mine, and for a moment, everything felt suspended. She seemed to recognize me, her eyes widening with a mix of relief and terror. "It's happening again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not over. It never ends." I didn't know what she was talking about, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear I had felt just moments ago. She seemed to be pleading with me, silently begging for help or understanding. Before I could respond, she turned and ran, disappearing out the door, leaving me standing there in the silence of the lobby. The shard of glass slipped from my hand, falling to the floor with a soft clink. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. Who was she? What had she meant by what she said? And what had happened in that apartment? But as I stepped toward the door, I heard something behind me, a soft sound, a whisper, barely audible. "Evelyn." I turned quickly, but there was nothing. Just the empty, quiet lobby. Had I imagined it? Or was it something else, something I wasn't ready to face? I pushed open the doors and stepped outside into the cold night air, the city lights flickering in the distance. The fear hadn't completely left me, but the apartment was behind me, and I was free. For now. I didn't look back. The city was alive with sounds, car horns, the hum of streetlights, the distant chatter of late-night walkers. Yet, despite the bustle around me, I felt strangely disconnected. I had left the apartment behind, but something was still following me. It wasn't the shadows in the hallways or the dark figures that had haunted the mirrors. It was the fear, the unease, the feeling that no matter how far I ran, it would always find me. I had walked away from that place, but a part of me had stayed. A part of me was still trapped in those walls, still bound to the ghosts that lingered there. Evelyn's name echoed in my mind, and though I didn't know her, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives were somehow connected. She had known what was coming, had been living with it far longer than I had, and her warning, her panicked words, haunted me. As I stood on the busy street corner, the cold air biting at my skin, I realized that leaving wasn't enough. Running wasn't enough. There would always be remnants of what I had experienced in that apartment. The apartment, the strange incidents, the figure that had reached out to me in the mirror, it was like a stain, one that no matter how hard I tried to scrub away, it would always linger. I hadn't gone back to check on the apartment, nor had I asked anyone about it. The landlord, the neighbors, nothing. I didn't want to know more. The less I knew, the better. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things I couldn't understand. And some things I realized, are better left in the dark. I turned toward the familiar skyline, trying to lose myself in the city's pulse, hoping to leave the lingering tension behind. But in the corner of my mind, I kept wondering about Evelyn. Why had she said those words to me? What had she known? And why had she run off into the night, leaving only more questions in her wake? I knew I would never have answers. I wasn't meant to. There was no closure. The apartment, the figures in the mirror, the cold air that seemed to follow me, it wasn't a chapter that could be neatly closed. It wasn't a story that could be finished. There was no ending where everything made sense, no final word that would explain what I had been through. It had been something beyond that, beyond reason, beyond understanding. A part of me resented that. I wanted to know why it had happened, why I had been drawn into this nightmare. What had I done to deserve it? But in truth, I knew there was no answer that would ever satisfy me. Some things simply didn't have explanations. Some things couldn't be reasoned with. The supernatural, the unknown, didn't follow the rules of logic. It didn't care for the questions we asked or the answers we sought. As I walked down the street, I realized that, perhaps, that was the most unsettling thing of all. That was the true horror. The uncertainty. The feeling that, no matter how much we run, we can never truly escape the past. The memories of that place would always stay with me, etched into my mind, scarred into my soul. And there would always be that shadow, lingering at the edge of my vision, just out of reach. Maybe it wasn't the apartment that haunted me, I thought. Maybe it was the fear itself, the realization that we can't control everything, that some things are too powerful to fight. Maybe, in the end, it was our own fear that haunted us. It's the one thing that follows us, no matter how far we go. The night had deepened, the city lights casting long, jagged shadows across the sidewalk. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see something, anything from the apartment, following me in the distance. But there was nothing. Just the ordinary noise of the city, the ordinary rush of people living their lives. No one knew what I had been through. No one could see the fear that still clung to me, the weight that pressed down on my chest, the shiver that ran through me every time I thought of that apartment. I stopped walking for a moment, staring at the ground, taking in the sounds around me. And for the first time, I realized something. Something that had been gnawing at me ever since I'd left that apartment. It wasn't just the apartment that was haunted. It was me. The past wasn't something you could leave behind. It wasn't something you could outrun. The darkness, the fear, it followed you wherever you went. It seeped into your thoughts, your dreams, your very being, until you no longer recognized yourself. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, lost in thought. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what I had encountered or of what I had become. The apartment had done something to me, something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't shake. It had left its mark. And though I could never go back, I realized there was no escape from it. Not really. With a final, heavy sigh, I continued my walk through the city, the night stretching on ahead of me. It was quiet now, the world around me a blur of lights and sound. But in the back of my mind, I could still hear the whispers of the apartment, the whispers of Evelyn, the whispers of the past. And in that silence, I understood. Some stories don't have endings. They simply linger. And no matter how far you run, they always find a way to follow you.